Damn it, I've been muted this entire time. Thanks, guys. That wasn't a sarcastic thanks, guys. That was just me. Whoopsies. All right, well, at least it's only been a couple minutes. Thank you. So, Zoinks. As you can imagine me just silently clicking off those videos, I was explaining what we had watched last night and then what we were getting to this night. So as you guys can tell, we will be watching Bloodborne lore, What Really Happened to Laurence, Part 2, Revelations of the Altar. We had watched the first video a while back, but I'd forgotten to link it into my video description, so I'll probably need to remember to go back and do that in case anybody was interested in checking out my reaction to the first video. And for those who may be unfamiliar with Charred Thermos, he had a YouTube channel which he kind of deleted due to like some kind of pressure. Maybe he just didn't want to do the YouTube thing, and then thought about it a bit more and came back fairly recently. So this video came out 4 months ago. I don't remember when exactly he reactivated his channel. Actually, I'm not sure if this is technically still his channel or if it's a new one made. Okay, so only like 5 months ago. So we watched the first part of this on stream back when it was still his old channel, and then we didn't get to the second one or his other videos. And tonight's video we are going to be watching at Charred Thermos's request. So that's what we have queued up for the first video of the night. And then following that up, we will be watching the DLC that split the Souls community in half, the video that we didn't get to last night by Evan Explains. So we've only got 2 videos queued up right now, but I imagine that there's going to be a lot of discussions about them. So we might need to pivot and wing watching another small one after all of that. So maybe the Zaya Storm video about Godskins and whatnot. So anyway, I hope you're all doing well as always. Dave, Lil Homie, Elden Enthusiast, True Connoisseur, Corvanus. How's it going? All right, so now that I feel a little bit silly for having forgotten to unmute myself again, I will shut up for real and begin the video. All right, here we go. Bloodborne lore, What Really Happened to Laurence, Part 2, Revelations of the Altar by Charred Thermos.
Few characters in Bloodborne loom larger and prove more consequential than Laurence. He's a transformative figure in Yharnam's history, and it's the mystique of his character that makes him so intriguing. He speaks only 5 lines of dialogue, and we never see him alive, yet we experience his legacy at almost every stage of the game. That's probably why the more we learn about Laurence, the more we can demystify Bloodborne's lore. And that's precisely why I dedicated a lengthy episode in December 2022 to this very effort, titled What Really Happened to Laurence. The video challenged some of the most long-held beliefs about the game's story, which caused some confusion and a good bit of disagreement. But there's much more to Laurence's story than we could address in one session. In this episode, we'll continue uncovering hidden pieces of Laurence's past, including his role in the establishment of the Healing Church and his life after death, so to speak.
All right, so as far as like the disagreements, I don't remember a lot of the first video other than Charred Thermos making some really interesting real life comparisons to the types of equipment and imagery used by the hunters and whatnot in Bloodborne, which was really cool. But basically, from what I've heard on the grapevine with Charred Thermos' videos, a lot of the disagreement tends to stem from the authoritative tone which he uses in his videos, which is something that I have a big issue with in general. I don't particularly remember that video being super bad on that front by any means, but I've definitely heard that kind of overwhelming consensus about his Agony of Effort series, if I'm remembering correctly. So with this in mind, I'll just kind of like make my blanket disclaimer that I typically disapprove of the authoritative tone of voice without or when things are more or less speculation, or if there's room for disagreement or ambiguity. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump back in.
We'll clarify a few points from the previous video that left some viewers unsatisfied and unmoved. And we'll correct a mistaken conclusion about the identity of the scholarly figure presiding over the surgery altar.
That's really funny. So just talking about the whole tone of authority, when you have to open up with the next video that's like, oh, I was mistaken about this. I feel like you end up shooting yourself in the foot in that if you're mistaken after having, definitively concluded something before, then like, why should the audience continue to believe you now? And of course, it is always a little bit more of a pain to try and use that non-definitive language, and some people might not take you as seriously, I guess, but I mean, they can just deal with it in my eyes. I'd rather have people I'd rather things be presented precisely and people draw their own conclusions, even if they inadvertently take things which are stated as speculation as authoritative. That's kind of more on them and beyond the help of the author of like the video essay or whatnot, which is kind of one of the dangers of like doing like lore tubing and stuff, in that you might present something one way, but somebody can misinterpret it and think something else. And that isn't necessarily entirely an issue of translation. It happens all the time with fluent speakers of any given language. So, hey, Tony Pepperoni, how's it going? Honesty is almost always better. I like the almost there. And Matthew Sargent, nice to see you again. You'd rather watch a lore tuber who corrects themselves, if anything. And yeah, that's a great point to bring up as well, that we should also commend Charred Thermos for addressing what shortcomings may have been in his previous videos, because that always kind of sucks to just take it on the chin and admit one is wrong, but I think it's a mark of maturity and it should be recognized and celebrated. All right, here we go.
In conclusion about the identity of the scholarly figure presiding over the surgery altar. My sense is that for us to determine who this person is, we just need to know who this person is. I'm convinced we already know the answer to that. And there's a collection of details I missed before that might blow the lid off the mystery about what really happened to Laurence. If you watched my previous video about Laurence, you already know my thoughts about the identity of the body on the surgery altar. It's incredibly hard to see how this could be anyone other than Laurence. The evidence is just so compelling. Understandably, there was some skepticism around this idea, so let's explore it much more thoroughly.
Yeah, I'm skeptical right now, and I wonder if he's trying to say that this is literally the body of Laurence, or if it's a figurative representation of him. Because I think it could make sense as a figurative representation, but if he's speaking literally, I would definitely be less agreeable to that idea.
The key to identifying this body lies in the interconnection between Bloodborne's 3 cathedrals, which include 2 cathedrals in the Hunter's Nightmare and the Grand Cathedral in the Waking World. Within these 3 cathedrals, we find 4 distinct altars, and the tiny details within these 4 spaces make a monumental impact on Bloodborne's story. Although they vary in their designs, the altars we find in the Waking and Nightmare worlds have one main feature in common. Upon each altar, we find something representing the bodily remains of Laurence. Let's examine. In the Waking World Grand Cathedral, we have an altar upon which rests the beastly skull of Laurence. We're shown that these are his actual physical remains, because touching the skull allows us to somehow access his memories. So, Laurence's bodily remains are found on an altar in this cathedral in the Waking World. As we know, there are 2 Grand Cathedrals in the Hunter's Nightmare. In the first of these Grand Cathedrals, we find another altar, this one displaying the lifeless cleric beast body of Laurence. This is a nightmarish and highly stylized depiction of his remains. Here, as before, we have an altar in a cathedral upon which we find a depiction of the bodily remains of Laurence. Within the second Grand Cathedral in the Hunter's Nightmare, we find the surgery altar. Yet again, we're in a cathedral that contains an altar, specifically the surgery altar, where we find yet another set of bodily remains. We don't yet know the identity of this body, but there seems to be a pattern emerging here. what we discover is that everything we can do or observe in this space, the surgery altar, yields clues that connect this body to Laurence.
All right, I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of annoyed at how repetitive it's been so far. I feel like he's just made this same point like 6 times in a row, and it's getting a little bit circular. So I'd like it to proceed a bit more there. And the realist, welcome back into the stream. How you doing? And then Loam sees lots of parallels of Bloodborne to Sekiro, and in their mind, they fill the gaps with Laurence's stories with Genichiro. It is kind of interesting how many of the motifs kind of play off of each other between the games. I try to treat Elden Ring a lot more as its standalone title with some vague kind of references, maybe not references, but similarities between like Bloodborne and its use of the cosmos. But after the DLC, I actually see a lot more of like the Dark Souls fingerprint in Elden Ring as well, other than, you know, the kind of setting. Why have I given into madness? Because we're frenzied, bro. How's it going, Jack Irish? Nice to see you again.
As I detailed in What Really Happened to Laurence, if we want to unlock the surgery altar elevator, we do that by going to the other Grand Cathedral in the Nightmare, this one containing the cleric beast body of Laurence, where we pick up the item called the eye pendant from Laurence's hand. We then take it to the other Grand Cathedral, where we place it into the skull of the dissected body on the surgery altar. This directly links Laurence, in his cleric beast form, to the dissected body on the altar. When we then use the surgery altar elevator to raise the platform, directly below the surgery altar, we find our 4th and final altar. It's here we're able to obtain the item called Laurence's Skull, yet another reference to Laurence's bodily remains. Everything about these altars in the Nightmare Cathedrals and in the Waking World Grand Cathedral relates to the bodily remains of Laurence.
Okay, I got the point.
His beastly skull, his human skull that nightmarish depicts.
I'm fast forwarding. If the video let me.
Of Laurence's bodily remains, it's very hard to see how the surgery altar is doing anything different. It's showing us Laurence's dissected human body. This pattern is certainly persuasive, but it's the clues we receive later that prove much more convincing. After we retrieve the item Laurence's skull, we can take it back to the other Nightmare Cathedral, where we essentially resurrect Laurence simply by bringing him his human skull. Laurence returns to life and immediately closes his hand that was holding the eye pendant, as if he realizes that it's missing or has been used for something. It was because we placed it in the skull of the dissected body on the surgery altar.
I see where he's going with that. I never really thought about his hand trying to like look for the eye pendant. I'm a little bit skeptical because I feel like he'd be more or less looking for his skull rather than that eye pendant. But of course, like the eye pendant is part of the quest to kind of get his skull and like bring it back and whatnot. So I don't know. I guess I'm on the fence, but I think that's a neat observation regardless. And Realist was asking if I plan on making future Bloodborne content, and you remember watching me in the past before Elden Ring came out. So about that, kind of, but not actively. Like there is one video that I wanted to make, or like one subject for a video that I wanted to make a while back, but I just haven't gotten around to it. So if I ever get the urge to do it, I'll do it. But I've already got that essay out on my like translation spreadsheet, because that was what I was doing before I made video content. So if you go to my translation spreadsheet, which I think is linked on all my videos, and go to the Fear the Old Lore essays, where do we have it? The inspiration for Queen Yarnum and Murgo's Wet Nurse. I talk about Kosodata Yude, which are like wandering ghost ladies who are like looking for infants, sort of. And I think that could be an inspiration for both Queen Yarnum and Murgo's Wet Nurse, and would tie into why both seem to be like searching for baby Murgo. So that is one idea for a video that I just haven't gotten around to doing. But honestly, I feel like I've covered Bloodborne in as much depth as I pretty much could with when you account for the 2 lore throughs and the 1.0 playthrough. And then Loam says Sophie from Sinclair lore found out that the guides for the altar elevator are on the main gate and also the mesh of a second floor of the cathedral that's different from how it is. I wonder if some of that is from like earlier in development. We saw a Brightus within the Grand Cathedral, I believe in the Project Beast trailer, or if not that one, it may have been like the very, very first. Well, the first Bloodborne trailer that was like a Bloodborne trailer, not Project Beast, so like the second one, but I don't remember. Probably gonna have to wait for another 3 years for our new game comes out. Even still, there's some other topics that I'd like to do. There's a lot of Elden Ring stuff that I want to cover, and I'm just like trying to compose my thoughts and all that. So definitely have quite a bit of content. So even if we eventually run dry of the Elden Ring stuff, there are other games and things that I want to cover as well. So here we go. Oh yeah, I still want to make like another big Dark Souls video, which I haven't gotten around to, but you know how it goes.
That's when Laurence reaches up and places his other hand on the top of his head, the same place where the dissected body is missing the top of its skull. But what's more, later in the boss fight, Laurence's legs suddenly and rather inexplicably explode, and he spends the rest of the fight crawling around on the floor. Why? It's because the dissected body on the surgery altar is missing its legs. The physical reactions of Laurence, the first vicar, are a direct reflection of the physical features of the dissected body on the surgery altar. These aren't the only parallels here. As we just observed, the altar of the Waking World Grand Cathedral looks almost identical to the lower level of the surgery altar. That doesn't seem particularly important on its own, but we absolutely cannot dismiss the design of this area. It was almost certainly designed not to be a duplicate or a copy, but a sort of reflection or inverse. On the Waking World altar, we find the beastly skull of Laurence. Not his whole body, just his beastly skull. In the Nightmare version of this altar, we find what's essentially the opposite. We find the item Laurence's skull, which is a depiction of his human skull. The altar doesn't contain his whole body, just his human skull. So, one altar has a beast version of his skull, one has a human version.
Alright, that's a little bit too repetitive for me, but I think if his body was anywhere, it might be in the reliquary above him, if that is indeed a reliquary, but yeah, okay.
In this regard, the altars are two sides of the same coin. Let's apply this same rationale to the two remaining altars. In the other Nightmare Cathedral, we have Laurence's cleric beast body. Not just his skull, but his whole outstretched beastly body. If the same rules apply to these two altars as they did with the altars containing Laurence's skulls, what should we expect to see on the fourth altar? We should find some version of Laurence's outstretched human remains. On the surgery altar, what do we have? We have what appears to be Laurence's human body.
I'm trying to be nice, but I'm struggling. Like, one thing that really bothers me is like repetition in general. And I'm not trying to like dunk on Charred Thermos. This is a me problem where the more things repeat, the more I have to force myself to pay attention. And so if he starts talking about something else, my mind might start wandering just because it's not getting stimulated enough from all of this repetition. But I did want to say that I did like the comparison of Laurence losing his legs in the second half of the fight in Phase 2 to this guy up here not having legs either. And I hope that he'll go into more detail as to how he reconciles the Nightmare's beastly version of Laurence to this humanoid version, which came first, which came second. If Laurence transformed into a beast, does he believe it happened after death? Does he think that the beast transformation happens after death? Because I could see some arguments being made for that, although I'm not entirely sure how well that would mesh with the way that we see characters like Gascoigne transform right before our eyes, and like the abhorrent beastly, what's his name? The suspicious beggar. And then Draco, nice to see you again. Okay. Here we go.
Not just his skull, but his outstretched human body. These altars are two sides of the same coin. There's more evidence that supports this concept, which we'll come back to in a bit, but there's still more to discuss. It's well known that the cleric beast body of Laurence is posed similarly to Christ in Michelangelo's La Pietà, which gives a divine aura to his corpse and helps to cast Laurence as a Christ-like figure. As I've mentioned in other videos, there's no Mary figure here in this display. It's just Laurence. But he's lying on top of abundant drapery that recalls the cascading cloth of Mary's dress within Michelangelo's sculpture.
I think that's kind of true, but also kind of not. Hopefully it'll back up. Because I would say you either have the Mary picture, a representation on the thrones themselves on the chair, like the little relief sculpture. Although this isn't a chair exactly, not like a throne here. But beyond that, you might also make the argument that the winged angel-esque statue above Laurence could be a kind of a stand-in for Mary and or the divinity of the Bloodborne universe, but we don't really know.
That recalls the cascading cloth of Mary's dress within Michelangelo's sculpture. Why is this relevant? Well, what do we see on the surgery altar? Quite similarly, we see a corpse lying upon abundant drapery that extends in rippled sheets down to the floor. This equation of Laurence with a cadaver is why I've repeatedly argued that Laurence is actually positioned to look like the plaster cast of a dissected body called From Nature, made by Scottish anatomist John Goodsir in 1845, which itself was an anatomical homage to La Pietà. We have an actual cadaver on this altar, and we have a cleric beast posed like Goodsir's cadaver on the other altar. So to summarize, we have the following connections between the surgery altar containing the dissected body and the Nightmare Grand Cathedral altar containing Laurence's cleric beast body. Laurence holds the eye pendant in his left hand. He's lying atop an altar covered in bountiful drapery. We take the eye pendant from Laurence and put it in the skull of the cadaver on the surgery altar, which is also lying on top of bountiful drapery. The cadaver is missing its legs, and Laurence's legs explode during his boss fight. The cadaver is missing the top of its skull, which is where Laurence places his hand during his boss fight cutscene. On one altar, we have...
I feel like that's a little bit of a stretch. I'm also not on board with the whole drapery thing, because it's not entirely uncommon to cover up the more grotesque parts of things, if for no other reason than like censorship to a small degree. But I don't want to necessarily take that angle for this, because Bloodborne's a pretty gory game by all means necessary, by all things considered. That's the phrase. So damn it, I was going to say something else. And then, Elmo, nice to see you again. Would a Bloodborne 2 be better to take place at the same place or a new city being affected? I would almost wish for like a completely different region. It's long been my preference that we get like a FromSoft game that is their take on either like an Aztecan or ancient Egyptian type setting, or like Mayan, because that stuff seems like it could be super cool for the way that they like integrate their boss and monster design. I mean, look at how cool the Divine Lion was. Now just imagine some of like the damn like Egyptian gods like Anubis, Set, etc., Horus, all of them. And Loam thinks that they cut off his legs so that way the table wouldn't be too long. That'd be another possibility. A little bit lazy, but it's certainly possible. And hey, Stella, nice to see you again.
Have a cadaver. On the other altar, we have a cleric beast posed in a position...
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. I did like this comparison. I think even if somebody doesn't want to, or even if somebody does buy into the whole Pietà position thing here, I think you could definitely make a case for using this sculpture as a reference model. The Sun Realm is in ancient Egypt? Exactly.
And identical to that of a cadaver from a work of Victorian medical art. Finally, there are 4 total altars in the game's 3 grand cathedrals. 2 nearly identical altars contain the beast skull and the human skull of Laurence. The other 2 altars contain outstretched dead bodies, one of a beastly version of Laurence, the other of a human. If the logic of the altars applies here, this should be Laurence's human body. We know Laurence is a transformative figure in the development of the Healing Church, considering his skull is a holy relic held within the apse of the church's grand cathedral. It's interesting then that the surgery altar in the Hunter's Nightmare would be found in the same position within the apse of this cathedral. Given the prominence of the surgery altar, its placement within a cathedral, and its unique design, we can assume it's a place of great importance within the history of the Healing Church. This seems even more reasonable given the item description of the eye pendant, which unlocks the surgery altar elevator. The elevator takes us to the research hall, a private place accessible to only chosen members of the Healing Church. All of these elements, when taken together, help us draw our first major conclusion from this episode. The cadaver on the surgery altar is the human body of Laurence, and the scene depicted here is a snapshot of a pivotal moment in the history of the Healing Church. This conclusion will seem even more accurate once we reach the end of this video. As I mentioned at the end of the previous Laurence video, the cathedral containing the surgery altar seems to show us the saga of Laurence in 3 acts. And I believe we're shown 2 depictions of Laurence's dead body in this cathedral, one shortly after his death, and one after his body had been dissected. Let's take a closer look at this idea. If we take the surgery altar elevator from the base of the research hall down to the cathedral's main floor, what do you see? It's impossible not to notice the bright light flooding the surgery altar, almost like the table is being lit up for a surgical procedure. It's so striking, in fact, that I wondered if there were other features in the cathedral that are illuminated in the same way. As we move toward the other end of the cathedral, we see light streaming into the church from the upper windows, but it's mostly shining onto the floor, which doesn't contain anything other than the same mandala pattern we see throughout each of the 3 grand cathedrals. But the light is also shining directly onto the face of the dead body shown in this effigy tomb. So on one end of the cathedral, we have an effigy tomb depicting a recently deceased person wrapped in a death shroud, and on the other end, we have a cadaver on a surgery altar. The lighting is a link between them.
I am really skeptical of this kind of claim just because the sources of lighting in Bloodborne are inconsistent with like their actual light sources. And I think part of that is to highlight the dreamlike nature of the environment, because for whatever reason, if you go down into the Chalice dungeons and you ever go to like depths 3 and beyond and whatnot, you will see moonlight seemingly streaming in way underground below like 2 or 3 other floors that you've already like just spelunked past, essentially. So I am very skeptical about this right now.
It's also worth noting that in terms of lighting, we don't observe anything remotely similar in the other 2 cathedrals in the game. There's a little bit of moonlight shining into the Waking World Grand Cathedral, which illuminates the floor on one side. The Nightmare Grand Cathedral, though, doesn't have any major light source, and only the altar is slightly illuminated, but nowhere near the extent we see in the Surgery Altar Cathedral. The lighting here is unique, it's incredibly noticeable, and therefore it was almost certainly designed this way with intent. I think it's to help us connect these 2 corpses. The design of these 2 monuments also seems to be very intentional, with real-world associations. Tomb effigies have been a form of funerary art for thousands of years, but so-called recumbent effigies, which display a deceased person lying on their back on a stone slab, became more established in Europe and Great Britain in the 11th century and continued to increase in their intricacy over the next several hundred years. These early effigies were carved for the tombs of royalty, typically capturing the deceased in a regal and flattering light, and showing them as youthful and lavishly dressed.
Here we get the Ray Lucarian type of statue going on.
That's not what we observe with the sculptures in this cathedral, which display unadorned dead bodies at 2 points after death. That's why I think the surgery altar and the effigy monument on the other end of the cathedral appear to be inspired stylistically by what are known as transi, or cadaver monuments. Popular among the landed elite and the high clergy of the 14th to 16th centuries, cadaver monuments emphasized human mortality, in stark contrast to the traditional gisant monuments of earlier centuries that we just discussed, which captured the deceased as they were in life, typically adorned in formal regalia to signify their status. Although a subset of cadaver monuments called verminous cadaver monuments showed the corpse having been eaten away by worms or other creatures, most cadaver monuments, especially those of Great Britain, displayed the dead not as decayed corpses, but instead as emaciated bodies still containing their outer flesh, with their abdomens either degraded or completely eviscerated, meaning the internal organs of the abdomen or viscera were removed. Believed to be the first cadaver monument produced in Great Britain, the tomb of Archbishop Henry Chichely was completed around 1425. Just like Bloodborne's cadavers on or near the surgery altar, Chichely's tomb is found within a cathedral, specifically the Canterbury Cathedral in southeast England. This is the case for the majority of Britain's 44 known cadaver monuments, which are mostly contained in cathedrals or abbeys and were made for senior clerics of the Roman Catholic Church. Chichely's tomb is a so-called double-decker style, with the top effigy showing the archbishop as he was in life, dressed in full church attire. Below, however, is a sculpture depicting his recently deceased body, lacking all adornment except for his burial shroud. The burial shroud is a common feature of cadaver monuments, often lying beneath the body or sometimes partially draping the deceased to preserve their modesty. The body in the tomb effigy, as with most real-life cadaver monuments, is draped in a death shroud. This sculpture also is found in a cathedral whose design is highly influenced by the Roman Catholic Church, just as...
I wonder if he's going to highlight either the... I don't think this place actually has a real name. The cathedral right before Ludwig, or before the second grand cathedral of the Hunter's Nightmare, or its equivalent, the one that we go underneath the coffin statue to get into Old Yarnum. Because I think this depiction is kind of similar to those two, but I don't exactly remember off the top of my head. And then Scott Leasy, nice to see you again. You'd prefer a Central or South American Bloodborne 2? I could see where you're going with that. And then Almo thinks a Bloodborne in India or Arabia would be cool. Absolutely.
With the Transi sculptures. And because of its design style and the fact that it's brightly illuminated like the surgery altar, I really don't think this effigy is a cast-off environmental asset, even though we do find this exact same asset elsewhere in the game. Call it a scavenger hunt. You can let me know in the comments if you know where else this asset can be found and what you think it means in that context. If the moonlit corpses in the cathedral are showing us the same person, and if it's Laurence...
No, I wonder... I don't think I actually have a picture of that, but I might have footage. Old Yarnum? Man, I don't even know what I would have labeled it. Let me pull the chat back up. Yeah, I don't have anything super great on hand. Although I probably would have labeled it Cathedral Ward, like going to Old Yarnum. The thing is, it's in a bit of an awkward place. Wait, what about behind Alfred? No, that's different. Okay. I'm not going to take too much time to look into this. I was just curious if I had anything nearby on hand. Yeah, it'd probably be faster to like load up the game almost. All right, yep, I'm going to go back to the video.
This leads us to the second conclusion of this episode. The surgery altar and tomb effigy show that Laurence died as a man, not a beast, and was later dissected as a man, not a beast. If this is true, it's an
okay, cool. I'm glad that we're getting to this point now.
Earth-shattering revelation about Bloodborne's plot. It also leaves us to wonder how we end up with Laurence's beastly skull in the Waking World Grand Cathedral. I think there are several possible explanations which we'll explore in the next episode. But before we can get there, we need to finish our examination of the surgery altar. There's much more here for us to dig through. I stand behind everything I said in what really happened to Laurence, with one major exception. My mistake was thinking that the main scholarly figure shown in the surgery altar display is Willem, specifically a younger version of Willem. I got this flat out wrong. But why did I think that this is Willem? I went into much greater depth about my rationale in that previous video about Laurence, but the short version is that there are some details in the item descriptions of the Graveguard attire set, especially in the original Japanese, that indicate Willem might have been involved in the removal of a body from the labyrinth, also known as the Tomb of the Gods. If Willem and two of his servants did indeed remove a body from a tomb, most likely accessing it through the forbidden grave outside Byrgenwerth, it's not entirely unreasonable to think that the surgery altar is showing us Willem and his two servants dissecting that same body. I was also persuaded by one visual element in particular. The surgeon in the sculpture is wearing a tall papal or bishop's mitre, which is very similar to the one that Willem is wearing when we find him on the balcony overlooking the Moonside Lake. It also contains a blinder over the eyes, just like Willem's hat does. The problem with this idea, at least from a visual standpoint, is that if this were a depiction of a young Willem, the evidence just doesn't line up. In the Byrgenwerth cutscene showing the discussion between Laurence and Willem, Willem doesn't look anything like the figure leading the dissection ritual on the surgery altar. Willem looks like an old, decrepit man with a hairless face, but not at all like the slender, bearded man we see in the surgery altar sculpture. It just doesn't make sense that this would be a young Willem dissecting Laurence's body.
I just had the mental imagery that Willem kind of looks like Darth Vader after he takes off the mask. Not really relevant, but Disillusioned Dork, nice to see you again. It's been a minute. How you doing? He's using the SCP background music. I know. Man, why do I always have to like minimize this every time?
Because Willem was already old when Laurence was still alive. That's why I got this wrong. But it got me wondering, is this bearded figure supposed to be a named character in the game, or is it just some generic scholar from Byrgenwerth or maybe the early Healing Church? If it is just some random person, why didn't From Software just make him a third nondescript hooded figure? Why give him such specific features and clothing? To answer those questions, I tried to work backwards. If we know that this is Laurence, who would be responsible for dissecting his body?
I think I saw something on the wall there. Of course. All right, I'm gonna...
Features and clothing. To answer those questions,
This is almost identical to the patterns which appear in Lucaria. Or is this like in the debate hall room? It's slightly different, I think, but anyway, I don't remember if this flower thing appears in Elden Ring. This might be a Bloodborne exclusive. The thing is, I mean, the quatrefoils all appear. They all appear in like Farum Azula and Lucaria. A lot of the architecture is reused, but sorry, it's just what the lore hunters do. They just spend their time looking at these minuscule details.
tried to work backwards. If we know that this is Laurence, who would be responsible for dissecting his body? The clues point to one person, if we're willing to examine this from a completely new perspective.
Draining blood.
Just a short walk from the surgery altar is the underground prison housing our friend, Brador. And strange as it might seem at first, there are several notable details we can observe about or infer from Brador that open the door to the possibility that he might be the person depicted leading the surgery altar dissection. And yes, I'm using the term dissection even though this scene seems to show some sort of ritual. As I've repeatedly argued in my videos, Bloodborne's rituals are code for anatomical dissection. This location is one of the best pieces of evidence to support that argument. In terms of Brador, let's start with a couple of surface-level observations and then build our way into the strongest findings. Just like the figure in the sculpture, Brador has a beard. That might not seem like a very convincing detail on its own, I acknowledge, but it could be more than just a random design choice. If this person in the sculpture is indeed a named character from the game, there are very few who match this design. We have 26 NPCs in Bloodborne with whom we can interact. 16 of these 26 NPCs are men. 2 of these 16 men we never see in human form. That's Ludwig and Gilbert. We're left then with 14 male characters who have a human or human-like appearance that we can actually observe in-game or through data mined files. Of those 14, Brador is one of only 3 who has a full beard and mustache that would match the facial hair in the sculpture. The other 2 are the Blood Minister and Simon the Herald, but there's really not much that would suggest the surgeon in the altar is either of these 2 characters.
I'm curious why not. I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of people have made the Brador argument for defeating Laurence for a long time. I've kind of always been on the fence about it because we don't get explicit confirmation or denial one way or the other. So I've just always been open to hear what people have to say, but I feel like that was a little bit dismissive, and I almost felt like the Blood Minister's beard seemed a bit more similar to that surgery altar's depiction, but I mean, that was just a pretty quick look. It's probably worth further consideration. And also, the Blood Minister's eyes are closed. Like, the more that I think about it, like, his odd ties and connections to the Healing Church might be explainable if he's like, or at least was the dude on that altar. So I'm not entirely against that idea. Not that I fully support it either. And then Disillusioned Dork says, so far the timeline of events doesn't really make sense to you. In what regard? Or like this video, or just like in general?
But that's not the case with Brador. Environmental features provide a ton of information in Bloodborne, and I don't think we can overlook the mere proximity of Brador and the surgery altar. Brador can be found in a cell less than a few hundred steps away in what's essentially an adjacent hallway. Moreover, the tomb effigy showing what appears to be Laurence's recently deceased human body is almost exactly halfway between Brador and the surgery altar. The beard and the proximity are the shallowest observations we can make, but it's once we get into the subtleties of Brador's attire that we start making major headway.
Waiting.
Brador wears 2 important items, the beast-hide garb and the headwear called Brador's Testimony. The descriptions of these 2 attire pieces tell us that they're the scalp and the hide of a horrible cleric beast. Brador's Testimony specifically says he killed a compatriot and then wore his ally's own scalp. For years, many players, myself included, have presumed that the compatriot mentioned in Brador's attire set was Laurence. That belief largely rests on 2 supporting factors. First, we know that Brador killed a cleric beast based on the item descriptions in his attire set. Second, we know from the item Laurence's skull that, in reality, Laurence became the first cleric beast. And of course, the boss titled Laurence the First Vicar appears in the form of a giant cleric beast. So we know that Laurence became a cleric beast and Brador killed one. That's the bulk of the hard evidence linking the two. Beyond that, we've kind of had to rely on some less conspicuous details and a little bit of story crafting to try and make this work. But because we as a lore community had really yet to consider, let alone conclude, that the cadaver on the surgery altar is Laurence, we've missed what could be several valuable pieces of evidence that bolster the theory linking Brador with Laurence. Let me show you. According to Brador's...
All right, so right now I'm really skeptical, and I'm waiting to kind of pick apart this argument because I don't want to get too ahead of myself, so I want to give him the chance to fully make his point, but I do have some pretty big disagreements right now.
Attire set, Brador scalped a cleric beast and then wore the scalp. We can see this quite literally in the design of Brador's testimony. He also skinned this cleric beast and wore its hide. But let's think about this literally. What does this mean? It means Brador used a sharp object of some sort to remove the flesh from both the top of the head and the torso of this cleric beast. Why does this matter? Well, let's look again at the body on the surgery altar. What do we see? This body isn't a skeleton. There are still huge chunks of flesh around the pelvis and inside the ribcage. This is a cadaver on a surgery altar being manipulated by figures wearing surgical long gloves. This is a dissected body, and the flesh of the torso is missing. It's not just that it's all rotted away, it's been removed. This cadaver was skinned, just like Brador's compatriot. But much more importantly, it's missing the top of its skull. And not just as if it's been bashed in with a blunt object. It has a circular incision, as if the cranium was removed with a sharp object. It's been scalped, so to speak. This leads us to the third major conclusion of this episode. If the body on the table is Laurence's body, and it's been skinned and scalped, just like what Brador did to a cleric beast, it seems much more plausible that the cleric beast Brador skinned and scalped was Laurence.
So I don't entirely disagree with these premises, but I feel like the way that they've been presented is a little bit short-sighted and is seeming to cherry-pick its data. So, for example, he was trying to connect Brador directly to the figure on the altar. However, I think it's a bit strange that he ignores that. I should have looked at the time. I think it's strange that he says, like, we need to look at all of these environmental details, but he ignores that this guy is wearing highly religious garb. But when we meet Brador, he's wearing a foreigner's set, which implies that even though he is working for the Healing Church now, he doesn't seem to have as much of an affiliation to venerate the church in a religious capacity by continuing to don his gear, which puts him at odds with other church hunters like Father Gascoigne and even arguably like the imposter Yosefka. So why is he so confident that Brador is this guy is a little bit beyond me, other than just the beard connection and just being dismissive of the blood minister for no like discernible reason, just because he was more in favor of like the Brador connection. So I don't know how I feel about this so far. Like I am a little bit annoyed by the arguments ad nauseum. So just like the repetition of things, which makes it seem like it has more authority than it truly does at times. But I also understand like the whole YouTube thing of trying to make things clear, but this might not just be for me. So even though I don't disagree with the idea that it's possible Brador could have skinned Laurence and whatnot, I'm still not entirely sure why he believes Laurence died as a human. Wait, and then he came back as a beast, and then how that relates to skinning him as a human on this surgery altar. I'm struggling to reconcile which is a figurative depiction of what event, because if Brador has a physical hide of the cleric beast which he skinned, that does make questions arise as to the order of events between all of this information. And then we also have that added layer of ambiguity of the fact that we do encounter Brador in a dream. We fight a dead Laurence analog in a dream, and we also have an analog for his human skull. So I don't even think that his human skull, so to speak, is truly like his skull as much as it is a representation of an ideal form of his like humanity, which he lost. So that's kind of the fun of talking about Bloodborne, when we need to pick apart what is logically consistent and what is logically inconsistent due to dream properties, which is one of my favorite things. And I was actually watching A Nightmare on Elm Street again when I was like retooling all of my art for this stream and whatnot. So it's just kind of cool that we're looking at Bloodborne again so soon after watching that. And then Scalezi said, if Laurence's skull is a holy relic, you don't think they'd let Brador get away with scalping and skinning it? I mean, maybe you could make the argument because he's this dude, he could get away with it. Or maybe you could make the argument that the thing that he skinned was in the dream and nobody's like really there to stop him. Or even if he did skin it, maybe it's just like a dream beast that he skinned and it doesn't really matter because it's not a real thing. Kind of the way that like Nancy can pull out Freddy Krueger's hat from her dream in A Nightmare on Elm Street and whatnot. Disillusioned Dork said they failed to understand how Laurence could be the source of the old blood if Bergenwith was already testing its effects whilst Laurence was still human. So the way that I've always looked at this is that the old blood definitely supersedes Laurence in terms of its age, and it's a Tumerian thing essentially, and Bergenwith discovered it, and then Laurence took Bergenworth's discovery and gave it to the masses, which Willem disapproved of. And so, to the followers of the Healing Church, the source they received the blood from directly was Laurence or his Healing Church medical professionals. So, for all intents and purposes, he's their supplier in like a drug dealer kind of sense, whereas he's not like, he doesn't do the homegrown operation until perhaps like later once they figure out how to cultivate blood saints and whatnot. So hopefully that helps clarify things for you. Yeah, you'd want more evidence for this regarding Brador. All right, let's go back in. Where was I at? Like closer to the end of this? Okay, here. This should be good.
Brador's wearing the scalp and hide of a beast. How is this possible if he actually just dissected a human body? As with many aspects of Bloodborne, we're receiving a heavy dose of symbolism here. We'll return to this question soon, but for now, let's focus on what else we can observe about Brador. Earlier in this video, we saw how the surgery altar and the nightmare altar showing Laurence's cleric beast body are two sides of the same coin. One shows Laurence's recumbent beastly body, while the other shows his recumbent human body. But there's something a little less obvious here. The Nightmare Grand Cathedral contains an altar that's a mirror image of the altar we observe in the Waking World Grand Cathedral. Let's take a look first at the Waking World. Above the altar, there's a headless statue of some divine figure pouring what we could presume is blood from a holy vessel. It appears to be a feminine figure with a beast hide or fleece laid over her shoulder. The vessel and the beast hide are shown on her right side. Now, let's look at the Nightmare Grand Cathedral. Here, that same figure is facing the opposite way, pouring blood out of a vessel on her left side, with the fleece draped over her left shoulder. It's not immediately clear why this figure was reversed, and it's easy to simply assume this was done by the designers as a means of contrasting the Waking World and Nightmare versions of the altars. But that explanation doesn't seem to hold up, considering the lower level of the surgery altar, which we also find in the Nightmare, is essentially identical to the Waking World altar. The divine figures are facing the same direction. This indicates that From Software flipped the statue in the Nightmare.
Whoops, wasn't trying to show that off right then. I was just curious if the super early depiction of Laurence had... I don't see anything else. This is the only photo that I have of this. Wait, no, it's not. Yo, guys. If you put a freaking staff and some tree leaves on her, we've got America in Lanedell, that thing almost. So I was just curious about like the orientation and what they did and did not change over the course of development. Didn't mean to interrupt, but since I did, oh well. And then Loam says he's gonna, or wait a minute, True Connoisseur says he's going to propose that there's one person and two deaths. And you're not a fan of that notion. I'm not either. I mean, I'm willing to entertain it. I'm trying to think if there's anything that we kill in Bloodborne that does the old guardian ape. Which probably not, because I feel like we would talk about it a lot more. Other than, you know, killing the undead things. But yeah. And then Loam says, you mean he drank the blood and became the first blood saint? You mean the blood they found in Tumor had to be finite? It makes sense that the church cultivated it through its saints. Yes, essentially. He is the first minister of blood for the healing church. Oh, you mean in the sense that Charred Thermos argues that the beastly body of Laurence is literally where the church extracts its old blood from, i.e. their body and blood of Christ. I don't disagree with that. I think the issue is that to the adherents of the church, Laurence is venerated as the source of their blood, but that's because they don't have the full picture to know that the way that he got the blood was kind of blasphemous by like grave robbing, essentially. So I don't see there's like any particular contradiction right now, although I don't remember all of Charred Thermos's arguments on that front. So maybe there'll be some form of disagreement later on about that.
Grand Cathedral for a reason, and I'm pretty sure they did. Why? Well, let's ask ourselves, what else in this space is reversed when compared with what we find in the other cathedrals? This is a difficult question to answer, especially given that each altar is almost perfectly symmetrical, but there is most definitely something else that's flipped. The key to unlocking this mystery lies in the visual details of Brador's attire, meaning the actual beast scalp that Brador's wearing when we encounter him in his cell. Just like the bosses Laurence and the cleric beast, the scalp that Brador is wearing contains antlers. But unlike the cleric beast boss, whose design shows two fully formed antlers, one of the antlers on Brador's scalp is broken. Notice that this isn't applicable to the design of Brador's testimony or to the scalp that Brador is seen wearing when he invades us elsewhere in the Nightmare. It's only the case for the Brador we find in his cell, or what we could consider the actual Brador. Note that the broken antler is on Brador's right side. If we look closely now at Laurence, the first vicar within the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, we see the same feature. There's one antler that's broken off. But unlike the broken antler on the scalp that Brador is wearing, Laurence's broken antler is on his left side. These two beast scalps match. It's just that Laurence's scalp design was reversed, just like the divine figure in the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, the same place we find Laurence. The figure above Laurence's cleric beast body likely was flipped simply for this purpose, to provide the necessary point of reference that things in this cathedral might be backwards, so that we could confirm that Brador's scalp is Laurence's scalp.
Yeah, so I think this is one of those cases of a shortcoming just from a little bit of myopia of focusing too intently on the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, and it is a bit of a shame he doesn't bring up the Hemwick Cathedral in relation to all this, because we do have another Mary Pietà-esque depiction of presumably Laurence in the exact same pose as we do see him in the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, although we have the humanoid form of him, which might go on to help assert that Laurence could have died as a human, but I could also see arguments being made that this could just be a depiction that's supposed to have been shown to the masses to imply that, no, guys, Laurence didn't die a beast. Everything is good in the healing church. Shut up and drink your blood, you luscia. All right. So, Stowboat, nice to see you again. And then Scalezi says, given how statues and holy places are almost never pouring out blood, you'd argue you need active proof that the lady is pouring blood beyond the statue being in Bloodborne. So the one opening trailer of the game, there is a droplet that does drop from her urn. I think it looks more like mercury or like Quicksilver, but I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that it's supposed to represent blood, because blood is their connection to divinity in Bloodborne and the Healing Church more specifically. Laurence died for your sins. Canonically true, although perhaps not in the way that you may be thinking. He died so you could sin. And then Loam thinks that Laurence's transformation was an accident related to the creation of the Hunter's Dream. You find it curious that he seemed to try to control beasthood using the Beast Rune, though. Yeah, I've got some issues with that, but I don't want to get into it right now. So anyway, this depiction shows up elsewhere, so I feel like that pokes a kind of big hole into this whole mirror aspect of Laurence thing, which I think was just shaky to begin with. So I'm afraid the House of Cards might come tumbling down, unfortunately.
What are we supposed to take away from all the textual and atmospheric details we've uncovered? If we know that the cadaver is Laurence, and we know that Brador skinned and scalped Laurence, we can conclude that the man leading the dissection ritual on the surgery altar is Brador.
I feel like that's bad modus ponens. Well, this isn't modus ponens, but anyway, I disagree with the first premise and the second, because these are just ifs, but I mean, it's fair that he does highlight them as if statements, but I'm just going to say that even if these are true, I don't think it's entirely conclusive that the surgery guy would be Brador. And I think there's more evidence to suggest that it's not, because he's ignoring the environmental details, which he's been harping on, of him wearing religious garments here, but not so much while he's acting in the capacity of a hunter. And he seems to be a foreigner based on that attire, kind of similarly to our hunter.
The man leading the dissection ritual on the surgery altar is Brador. What does this all mean? It means that the game is giving us two stories and leaving it up to us to determine which one is true, or more likely, which one we should take literally and which one we should take figuratively. The item descriptions tell us a story of Brador, a healing church assassin who killed, skinned, and scalped a compatriot who had transformed into a horrible cleric beast, presumably Laurence. By contrast, the environmental features are telling us a parallel story, one that could either be interpreted literally or metaphorically. Brador was a scholar or surgeon who dissected Laurence's human body, removing the flesh of his torso, removing his cranium, and quite possibly cutting off his legs in the name of research. His clothes were covered in Laurence's blood and flesh from dissecting his dead body. Back to our question. Brador is shown wearing a cleric beast scalp and hide. If, in reality, he was a scholar who dissected Laurence's dead human body, then why is he wearing attire that looks like an actual cleric beast? How do we reconcile this? I think it's very fair to say that the nightmare is feeding us heaping doses of symbolism, and you don't have to be a crackpot conspiracy theorist to think so. Things often don't follow the rules of reality in the nightmare realms, in so much as there are rules of reality in Bloodborne. The Hunter's Nightmare is a massive distortion of the waking world version of Yharnam, and the references to Laurence within the nightmare don't align with what we know about Laurence from the waking world. We know that Laurence's cleric beast body doesn't look remotely similar to his actual beastly remains from the Grand Cathedral. Here, Laurence's skull is more rounded and ape-like, whereas the cleric beast's skull is much more elongated, like a hybrid of a wolf and a deer. More importantly, Laurence's actual beastly skull shows that he was much more human in appearance, even possessing long, straight hair, which we don't observe in the cleric beast version of Laurence. He still had many smooth, human-like teeth, not like the pointed incisors and canines we see within the mouth of the cleric beast. Assuming Brador killed or dissected Laurence, the cleric beast form we see in the Nightmare Cathedral and the cleric beast flesh we see in Brador's attire must be distortions, embellishments, or red herrings, because they simply don't match the waking world version of Laurence. But why? It gets back to the point that the altars are telling us two stories, one that could be interpreted literally, and one that could be interpreted metaphorically. I've mentioned repeatedly in my analyses that Bloodborne's central medical metaphor treats hunters as parallels to Victorian surgeons and anatomists, while beasts are treated as surgical patients and, much more commonly, cadavers. As I demonstrated throughout my Agony of Effort series and in the previous video about Laurence, the imprint of anatomical dissection can be found everywhere in this game. To name a few, Kaz and Yharnam were dissected, their unborn children removed. Lady Maria tells us that
I don't know how I feel about the Yharnam one, because when you fight her in the Chalice dungeons, her clones appear like this as well, whereas the main body does still have the ectopic pregnancy present within her. So maybe you can make the argument she gets dissected after the hunter defeats her down in the final Chalice dungeon, but that one's a little bit arguable, I suppose. But nonetheless, a lot of that also depends on one's what one believes the tie is between Queen Yharnam and baby Murgo.
Were dissected, their unborn children removed. Lady Maria tells us that a corpse should be left well alone, a warning against dissecting dead bodies. We find strange weapons throughout the Hunter's Nightmare, which are carbon copies of the cemetery guns used in Victorian Europe and the United States to protect graves from body snatchers who would sell the bodies of the recently deceased to surgeons for dissection. The butcher set in Japanese is called the dissection set and equates hunters with anatomists and beasts with cadavers. The name of the executioner enemies in Japanese means body disassembler or dissector. The so-called tomb prospectors of the church go digging through graves for special body parts. The examples go on and on and on. Even the church hunters likely are direct references to body snatchers. In Bloodborne, the hunt takes place at night, just like when body snatching occurred, always under the cover of darkness. That's why one of the nicknames for body snatchers, especially in the United States, was night doctors. According to American Black history scholar...
Bro, what are these garments? Did they take like curtains to just kind of use it to keep the gore off their suits? That's wild.
Gladys Marie Fry, the term night doctor, derived from the fact that victims were sought only at night, applied to both students of medicine who supposedly stole cadavers from which to learn about body processes, and professional thieves who sold bodies, living and dead, to physicians for medical research. Author and folklorist Mark Lasky noted that night doctors lurked the streets around medical schools, hospitals, poorhouses, and train stations in search of victims to kidnap for research purposes. Certainly that sounds much like the kidnapper enemies lurking outside of Odin Chapel, but it perfectly captures the black and white church hunters, doctors who roam the streets of Yharnam during the night of the hunt looking for the sick whose bodies might be used for experimentation. Why focus again on these references to anatomical dissection and the equating of beasts with cadavers?
I'm a little bit surprised he hadn't mentioned the so-called precautionary hunters. What set was that? Let me double check real quick. Oh, so it's the Black Church set? Did he just show that? He may have. honestly, it's been a minute since I've really looked at... Okay, yeah, it was the top one. I guess it's not... Okay, yeah, so again, I'm definitely surprised he didn't highlight this portion of the description. So that's why I thought it must have been something else. So anyway, I'm gonna go back forward.
Well, let's think about it. What do we see on the so-called surgery altar? As I mentioned before, we see 3 figures wearing surgical long gloves manipulating a dead body. But we also see a beast lurking below the surgical table, as if to signal that within the body of men lies a beast. Almost as if it's to be taken literally, that by dissecting a man's body, we unleash an inner beast or render the dead person a beast. That's what the metaphor seems to have been telling us all along, that beasthood is something found inside men. The beast roar says terrible things lurk.
Yeah, this is the description that I constantly cite for like that very reason. So glad he brought it up, because otherwise I was going to pause it and bring it up.
Deep within the frames of men. The clawmark rune describes beasthood as a horrific and unwelcome instinct deep within the hearts of men. The beast claw says that the beast within awakens as flesh is flayed and blood is sprayed. It's as though within man, as in literally inside him, lies a beast. Hunters, who are analogs for anatomists and surgeons, no longer see humans as people. They only see them as beasts to be carved up.
And so, speaking about this whole beastly thing, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent related to Elden Ring and Demon Souls more specifically, in that if the representation of beasts in Bloodborne is that it's the most basic desire of mankind, their most basic will, as in like the will of the universe, to survive and to continue to exist, and that is associated with the like nature of beastliness. Does that have any bearing on the presentations of the old one of Demon Souls, which is another beast which seeks to just kind of consume all of existence? And does that also help explain what might be going on with the Elden Beast, in that it is a product of the greater will, and does it also seek to just be insatiably fed with life from others so that it may continue to survive and grow? But anyway, that's just kind of one of the things that I've been thinking about. And if the will stuff doesn't make too much sense right now, I apologize. I'm probably going to do a video on this eventually, but I want to read a bit more Schopenhauer and a little bit more Nietzsche to tie some of that stuff in a bit more concretely. The Schopenhauer stuff has been oddly, I don't want to say poignant, but topical in relation to the concept of will and sleep in Elden Ring, which I didn't expect. So there'll be some fun stuff to come from that in the future. They're JoJo fans, truly ahead of their time. And according to Disillusioned Dork, a spoiler for the Agony of Effort series is that Thermos argues Laurence is also based on Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I could see that. I feel like that's just kind of one of the natures of a lot of the whole werewolf folklore, I guess. So that doesn't surprise me at all. You just imagine the church doctors doing human Laurence autopsy, all chill, and then all of a sudden a giant flaming beast came out and down on the table. That'd be wild indeed.
Jura counsels us to avoid this mindset, saying, in case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people. So while we could take the most literal path and assume that Brador killed and skinned Laurence after he transformed into a cleric beast, to do so is to ignore the mountains of symbolism and subtext here that are screaming to us that Brador somehow dissected Laurence's dead body. My belief is that the cleric beast imagery related to Laurence and Brador is purely symbolic, although it keeps in line with the dissection metaphor of the game that we've seen in dozens of other places. The surgery altar is showing us the closest version of reality regarding what happened to Laurence. This obviously raises many questions. If Laurence was dissected, why? What purpose did that serve? What implications does it have for the character and his impact on the rest of the story? And most obviously, if Laurence's beastly skull is in the Grand Cathedral, how did he become a beast? Before we can address these questions, we need to first go back through a very contentious and largely misunderstood portion of the previous Laurence video.
The Holy Medium.
Most of the disagreement involving the video, what really happened to Laurence, stemmed from the discussion of the so-called Holy Medium of the Healing Church. We learn about this term from Alfred when we encounter him in Cathedral Ward, where he gives us a brief history of the scholarly institutions in and around Yharnam. When we ask him about the College of Byrgenwerth, Alfred tells us, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb, meaning the Tomb of the Gods or the Chalice Dungeons. Alfred then goes on to say that the discovery of this holy medium led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. What exactly is this holy medium? A lot of people want to say it's the old blood, case closed. But it's much more complicated than that. Because it's never openly stated what the holy medium actually is, it's helpful to look at the original Japanese text of Alfred's dialogue. Citing the translation work of
Hey, I know that guy.
and Last Protagonist,
And that
I
guy.
noted in my previous Laurence video that while the English version of the game uses this term holy medium to describe whatever it was that the Byrgenwerth scholars discovered in and retrieved from the Tomb of the Gods, the original Japanese uses the term seitai, which can be interpreted in a couple of ways. The most common translation of seitai is Eucharist, meaning the bread and wine consumed by Christians during the ceremony of communion. Catholics in particular believe that once consecrated, this bread and wine...
I'm a little bit curious about the extra opaque holy body thing down here. I mean, that is literally what the characters break down to. It's just kind of funny. So I wonder if this is a mistake or if it's just like foreshadowing.
Catholics in particular believe that once consecrated, this bread and wine are the actual body and blood of Christ. That's interesting given that the term seitai can also mean simply holy body.
Oh, maybe he just like put it up there a little bit too early. Okay.
Which is used when referring to the physical body or corpse of Christ. This translation opens up the possibility that the Byrgenwerth scholars didn't just bring back some divine substance, they went digging through a place called a tomb and brought back a dead body. This also keeps in line with the extensive theme of body snatching and anatomical dissection that's central to Bloodborne's inspiration and design. While we're in Cathedral Ward, we're also able to ask Alfred about the Healing Church. As part of his response, he again refers to the Holy Medium, saying, "I have heard that the Holy Medium of blood healing is venerated in the main cathedral." Last Protagonist retranslates this line as, "For blood ministration, I've heard the holy body it originates from is enshrined within the Grand Cathedral." Similarly, Arukimania retranslates the line as, "I have heard that the holy body, source of the salvation of blood, is enshrined in the Grand Cathedral." These translations...
Shit. Okay. I could see how that could be misleading if you take the body part literally. Alright, I'm going to let him finish his point, and then I might need to address some things. Whoopsies.
much more strongly indicate that there was a bodily origin source of blood ministration that's enshrined or venerated in the Grand Cathedral. When we go to the main cathedral, what do we find that's venerated, meaning revered or deified? What is Vicar Amelia praying to? She's kneeling at an altar containing the bodily remains of Laurence. Alfred's two pieces of dialogue are suggesting that a holy body led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. That's why I argued that it was the retrieval of Laurence's body from the tomb and his subsequent dissection that led to the founding of the Healing Church and its widespread practice of blood ministration.
So this is kind of one of the funny moments where like my own Frog Nation moment has happened essentially, but not really. Well, I guess. I mean, I'll just stick with that. So anyway, here's the kanji for Seitai, the first one being holy, the second one meaning body, kind of most often depending on the context. Like Karada is definitely body, but it doesn't just mean body, and this is kind of like one of the issues of translating between languages, in that it can also mean a substance for something. Let's see if we have some good examples. Oh, okay, so I think ekitai would be like fluid. Yeah, so fluid is, that's what like the first character is, and like this Tai character, which is the same one as body essentially, it just means liquid. So it doesn't have to literally be a like body. It's just like a liquid thing essentially, but I don't know. Let's yeah. So anyway, like the holy body, I don't think that's too, that it should be understood as like a literal body, because all of the things pertaining to communion tie back into this holy substance which Alfred is talking about. So yeah, I think the Garamond dialogue might show this off a bit better, and this is also in the Chalice dungeon. Okay, yeah, so I think the Tumaru Chalice is a bit clearer than Garamond's dialogue actually, because they translated it a bit differently, probably because it doesn't align super well with like the spoken word. Let's make this bigger. Let me see how that looks for you guys. That should, yeah, I'll just make it a little bit bigger just to be safe. Okay, so let the chalice reveal the tomb of the gods, let blood be the hunter's nourishment, and let ye partake in communion. So the term used for communion here comes from Seitai, which is what I think that well, hold on, not exactly. You grant communion with the Seitai, which is like hard to describe. Yeah, okay. So the Seitai here is the kind of like reference of what they're having communion with. So they are not having communion with a literal corpse when you do the Tumaru Chalice ritual. You're having communion with the blood, which ties back into... Is this a consumable? It's a key item, right? Consumable? Key. No, neither. Material. With ritual blood. Because this is what's used in the Holy Chalice rituals. So this is one big disagreement that I would have with Charred Thermos. And I think this just goes into, once again, like hyper-focusing on one detail and not having the full scope in mind when looking at things, which I don't blame him for this. And perhaps my translations could have been a bit more clear that the holy medium, the holy body, is a reference to blood. So I rather like how Frog Nation called it the holy medium. I think that's an elegant way of dealing with that situation of like, oh, is this a body? Is this a fluid? Because it kind of preserves that ambiguity of the Japanese there, I guess. So, alrighty. All right, global sequence. We'll run it back up from the top. First, click the little red button all the way to the left on the stream, and then there you go.
Exactly what I think we're observing within the surgery altar cathedral in the nightmare. This is Laurence's recently deceased body, wrapped in a death shroud. He was buried in a tomb, but something occurred that triggered people to dig up his body and dissect it. Something associated with this process led to the founding of the healing church as we know it and its practice of blood ministration. This is the holy body, also known as the holy medium. Many people were incredulous at this assertion, but when it comes to the idea of Laurence being the holy body upon which the healing church was founded, this isn't just some wild theory of mine. Listen to the words of Bloodborne's creator and director Hidetaka Miyazaki. In 2016, Miyazaki did an interview about Bloodborne with Future Press, which covered various facets of the game. The interviewer turned to the topic of the famous Fear the Old Blood cutscene featuring Willem and Laurence, saying to Miyazaki, "The scene after you defeat Amelia also leaves a lot to the imagination." Miyazaki responded, "That's meant to give you a look into the memory of Laurence, who appears in the cutscene as well. His skull served as the start of the healing church itself, but it's taken the form of a twisted beast. There's a lot you can imagine from that." Miyazaki says here that Laurence's skull served as the start of the healing church. Alfred tells us that the holy body venerated in the Grand Cathedral led to the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. It seems
So going back to like the whole Catholic imagery here, like it's not just the body that people have communion with the wafer, it's also the blood represented by the wine. So I feel like, I don't know if this is like willful ignorance or if it's just wanting, just actual ignorance. And I don't mean to like use the term ignorance like disparagingly there. I mean it in a kind of like literal sense. Like I don't know if he just got the wrong takeaway from this, which, could potentially be a little bit on me and Aruki, but I feel like if you truly understand what the Eucharist is, it feels a little bit off to me to suggest that it's purely the body aspect of it and not the blood. And I think this also brings up questions of like, then why the hell is Willem telling Laurence to avoid the old blood to begin with if Laurence is the old blood of the healing church? I don't know how one reconciles this idea considering the greater context of the game right here.
To the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. It seems pretty obvious that they're saying the same thing. Laurence's body removed from the grave and dissected, somehow, some way, was the catalyst for the creation of the healing church and its practice of blood ministration. This is why I argue.
Let me look back at Alfred's dialogue. Holy medium. Hopley. Holy medium. So hold on. This is so weird to me, like trying to figure out what he actually thinks, because he does mention the holy medium of blood healing is venerated in the main cathedral, blah blah blah. But Byrgenwerth is an old place of learning under Yharnam. Once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the foundation of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. So did Laurence die within Byrgenwerth? I mean, I feel like that just is flatly contradicted by him being the first actual vicar of the healing church. That would, for him to have been the vicar of the healing church, he would have had to have been alive in some capacity. So unless he's trying to argue that Laurence lived and served as the vicar within the dream to begin with, I just cannot possibly begin to reconcile this idea right now. That's exactly your issue you've been internally yelling about. I didn't have the context. The timeline makes no sense. Yeah.
Argued in the previous video that Laurence got his name from Laurence Sterne, an 18th century English vicar turned writer whose dead body was removed from the grave and dissected. His cranium was sawn off, and the skull was likely kept on display at Cambridge. Understandably, there are some massive questions about what happened between Laurence's departure from Byrgenwerth and the rise of the Healing Church. That's especially true given that one of the most widespread and deeply held beliefs in the lore community is that Laurence left Byrgenwerth with the specific intent to establish the Healing Church. How could he establish the church if his skull was what started it? And what is a skull?
I think he's just taking that line by Miyazaki a bit too literally there.
Have to do with the establishment of blood ministration. If the scene from the surgery altar is in fact a representation of the dissection of Laurence's body, then it's possible that whatever was discovered inside his dissected skull, as Miyazaki indicated, was what served as the start of the Healing Church. What was discovered in Laurence's skull? The likeliest explanation is some kind of mystical blood. It's the so-called old blood. And that's where we'll continue next time. Thanks for watching.
All right, so it looks like we're not going to get to that old blood explanation that global sequence is talking about there, unfortunately. How much time do we have left? Yeah, I think we'll go over quite a bit if we watched the next one, but I feel like the next video is also a little bit too short for that. But hold on, I want to go to the skull quote. I don't know if there's a Japanese version of the Drained of Blood interview with Future Press that I can find. Anyway, I'll have to do some looking, but for anybody who ever wants to look info up about Bloodborne, I highly recommend bloodborne-wiki.com rather than Fextra Life, because this site has been heavily curated by actual fans of the community, Meph and her team and whatnot, which is mostly just Meph, but like the Tomb Prospectors and whatnot. So let's go to the skull quote. It's meant to give you a look into the memory of Laurence, who appears in the cutscene as well. His skull served as the start of the Healing Church itself, but it's taken the form of a twisted beast. Now, let's go into the notes of the game. When you go into the Grand Cathedral, immediately to the right, as you go in through the doors, there is a lore note on the, like, not wall, whatever you want to call that little platform type thing. And the note says, "Heir to the ritual of blood, purveyor of ministration. Place your hand on the altar's sacred covering and inscribe Master Laurence's adage upon your flesh." So, this is slightly different in Japanese, but the English is good enough to get the point that those who become the next purveyor of ministration, i.e. the next vicar after Laurence, they place their hands on his skull and get his kind of a message carved into their minds, and that message is fear the old blood. So it's kind of awkward to me that we get this message from Willem to Laurence telling us to fear the old blood. And oops, didn't mean to close that, but anyway, why would Laurence have died and then been exhumed and then started the Healing Church? I think like the ultimate conclusion is still like the old blood precedes Laurence and makes him special enough to make the Healing Church, which kind of led to everyone's downfall. So maybe he'll get to that point eventually, but I'm going to have to leave a comment on this video about the whole Seitai situation. Scaleezy says, Charred Thermos really loves saying things in-game directly represent the real-world things and people and cites no other sources than it lines up. That's a bit of an unfortunate thing to do. I mean, it's really easy to do. But yeah, that kind of goes back into what I prefaced earlier in the stream, in that I know one consistent issue that's been brought up about Charred Thermos's methodology is that they tend to use a bit of an authoritative tone about things rather than using modifiers like maybe, perhaps, potentially to kind of soften the blows and make the presentation of his arguments more amenable to some people, because like you guys saw with me having the issue with saying that the surgery altar guy is definitively Brador, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me for a number of reasons. And I am kind of a little bit offended that he just said, oh, it can't be the blood minister because it's Brador. Like, it's a bit circular there, and he doesn't explore the other possibilities, which if he wants to make the point that it's not the blood minister, that's perfectly fine. But I felt like that idea wasn't even entertained. Even if he did do it on his own time, it just sucks to not have that kind of to not get that methodology presented in the video. Especially since like so much of the like beginning of the video was argument ad nauseum, which is just repeating oneself over and over, which kind of is a like subliminal technique to make you sound more authoritative in tone, which I don't know if he's like doing intentionally as much as he is just trying to be clear, but it's a little bit overkill for me there. So Mumi M, welcome on in. You love the historical research he puts into this series, but this video is a bit of a floppy fear. So I've definitely heard a lot of controversial takes about Charred Thermos's videos. I'm the type of person that I'm afraid I'm going to hate them, and I kind of don't want to stream them because I tend to be very pedantic and nitpicky about these kind of issues, and I don't necessarily want to be overly negative about videos as I watch them on stream, just to like be honest with you guys. So I'm trying to keep that in mind watching this stuff, but I feel like even setting all that stuff aside, we do have some like actual like, what's the word? Continuity issues with the timeline that hasn't been really presented so far. So that kind of sucks. So maybe we'll wait for a part 3, but we'll have to see. Oh yeah, I also love the historical research as well. Disillusioned Dork said, Laurence absconds with blood. Laurence gives out blood to masses and becomes the Messiah. Laurence starts up using his own product. Laurence turns into the beast. Makes perfect sense to you. Now, I don't necessarily know if Laurence uses his own blood as much as it is that he could not withstand the effects of the blood and he was doomed to transform from the start. I think he was just kind of boned from the get-go. And yeah, Tony says, I think is a get out of jail free card. Exactly. Okay, so let's finish this up. Okay, we actually are finished. We're on the last second. So I'm going to leave a comment on the video. Hey, thanks for the reference! Exclamation point. Unfortunately, I think trying to break down say tie wrong say tie. Trying to break down Seitai. I gotta switch back. As a literal holy body overlooks a few things about how the Eucharist operates in Catholicism. In Catholicism and Japanese. Well, it's true the second character can literally mean body. It's meant in a general sense, kind of like how we can refer to a body of water in English. So calling it the holy medium does a good job of preserving some of that ambiguity in the Japanese. Of the Japanese in the English localization. The next thing to consider is that I'm just going to copy paste. The Seitai's connection to the Eucharist is meant more holistically to include the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. And the blood is a critical component of communion / transubstantiation. As such, Alfred telling the hunter to seek the holy medium. Hold on, let me think about this. Is him telling us to find the source of the body of blood. I'm not happy with that, but I don't feel like putting more time into it. And I was going to say something else. All right. Furthermore, the other ways in which Seitai hold on. Syntax. I don't like splitting these up. Furthermore, Seitai is also used in other descriptions like the Tumaru Chalice and Gehrman's dialogue about hunters partaking in communion. And it's not meant in the sense of a literal making it much clearer within the greater context of the game that it's a specific reference to blood rather than a literal body. P.S. I think you overlooked a critical detail on Brador's clothing in that he's wearing the foreigner's garb, which would make it seem that he's less affiliated, or that he's, I don't know, how do I want to phrase this? That he's not as high on the healing church ladder. Now, how do I phrase this? Damn it. Seem less likely that he'd be the guy wearing extra holy attire in the surgery altar. Especially when most church hunters continue to wear church attire while out on the hunt. Yeah, I know part 3 is already out. I don't think we have enough time to watch it tonight, which is why we haven't gone into it. But we'll probably get to that one tomorrow then. Scala says, does Lawrence's skull line up in size to the cleric's beast we fight, or did he turn into a smaller beast because he didn't struggle to keep it contained as much? So it doesn't really align with anything in the game. Unfortunately, the one on the Grand Cathedral altar. In some ways, it looks the most similar to the skulls of the bloodletting beasts, but it's not the same. And also, it's interesting that the final variant of the bloodletting beast is one that is headless, kind of like Laurence. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what the next video is about to get more conclusive thoughts on the matter. Meow Laser gave a customer a ride. Afterwards, you found they'd spilled communion wafers in your backseat. That sucks. If you are like doing Ubers or anything like that, I recommend having a little hand vacuum in your car so that way you could clean up after any passengers. Yeah, Scaleezy said the Eucharist literally being Christ's blood and body is also explicitly Catholic thing, and while the church teaches it, only about 1/3 of Catholics believe it, according to the Pew Research Center 2019. Nonetheless, I mean, the fact that it does use the kind of exact same kanji as the Eucharist in a game that's about communion with blood, I think is very evocative of the notion and should probably be taken a bit more holistically in that regard. So, okay, I'm actually not going to like the video because I didn't like the video, and I just want to be honest about that. So hopefully the next video will like win me over. I'm still willing to give the channel a chance, but just being upfront there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and transition into the next video of the night with, not that one. Wait, why is it going that way? Anyway, the DLC that split the Souls community in half by Evan Explains.
Primitive gameplay that is...
Alright.
It's hard to...
Oh boy. Alright. Now here we go.
Primitive gameplay that is hard to enjoy.
Hero bosses with Dark Souls
Recycled
combat.
bosses, so get ready for 5 more copy-pasted giant dragons in the first
I will flip my boat as soon as you add widescreen support.
DS3 is
this
better.
is beyond stupid. You are
No
literally
blind
blocking the view on
Since
both
the
sides.
DLC with the Day 1 patch, the performance of this great game
This
is
game
very
is freaking
bad. Before it
impossible.
runs
If you can
flawless
beat
on my
Pickle, you are a cheating
RTX 4050.
scumbag, and I know what you did. The DLC is freaking trash.
DLC is too hard. Longtime Elden Ring player, but damn it's
Is
tough.
Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree too hard?
Elden Ring is so huge now that Jitgud is no longer a battle cry.
Still maidenless.
Elden Ring DLC down to mixed reviews on Steam.
These Elden Ring DLC bosses are overtuned now. It's simple. First you dodge the lunge, then wait a beat, then dodge the second lunge.
And the one thing I keep seeing is people underestimate.
When did Sophie's Michael Zaki get on the channel here?
Estimating the impact of scattertree blessings.
Elden Ring's DLC is too hard.
How does it...
So, I don't know, man. I think one of the issues of comparing this DLC to like a lot of their other content is that aside from being build checked by like base game content, in that you can have harder times against certain enemies and bosses based on the build that you fight them with. Another thing which compounds a player's experience would be the usage of blessings and how many they had relatively for each boss. And because a lot of these bosses can be done out of order, I could imagine trying to go to Baal with having like maybe a blessing level of 2 or 3 and then just getting absolutely wrecked. Especially if you're trying to not summon or anything like that. So I kind of feel a little bit awkward having my own videos like, oh no, the DLC broke me. And I know I pissed a lot of people off with my video saying like, hey guys, I didn't use blessings because I know I'm going to explore too much. And people got really butthurt about that. I say people, but I mean really like the dichotomy between the people that at least liked that video and disliked it was like a 77 to 33% in the like department. So it's just kind of like a vocal minority, although it is a sizable chunk. But, you know, having played it with blessings, it wasn't that bad by any means, depending on like what part of the DLC I was at. But if you use all of the tools that the game gives you, it could either be trivialized or really hard depending on what tools you use. So it's really hard talking about Elden Ring for a variety of reasons. I don't like a lot of the boss designs because my preferred playstyle is mono e mono and not summoning, because I enjoy the challenge of like fighting a boss. But I feel like a lot of these bosses were a bit overtuned to make solo play enjoyable for me specifically. Although I know a certain subsect of the Souls population enjoys like the super challenge runs of like RL1. And a lot of people were saying when I did my Blessingless run, oh, that's no different than an RL1 run. Well, yes and no. I would honestly consider doing an RL1 run if it meant that I had access to the kinds of tools that I wanted to use, rather than being forced to use like 1 to 4 viable weapons for that entire option. But I'm going to give you guys a really, really hot take in that I think RL1 runs are kind of jokes anyway, because if people really wanted to make it a challenge run, they do it without upgrading their weapon or without using buffs or things like that. But they don't do that. They just kind of cheese it a different way. And it's not as impressive to me as something else would be, like a fist only run level 1. So that's kind of my hot take, but it's whatever. People can cry about it. And then Matthew regretted every blessing you used after about the 6th. Really? I'm very interested to learn more about that, because that was something that I was very afraid of doing. And because I had been saving my game files externally as I was playing through the DLC, I'm able to go back and see like how powerful I would have been relatively to each area. So by the time I would have fought the Divine Lion, I would have had 7 blessings, and that's probably like one of the very, very first bosses that most players face. Hey, thank you, Throne. I appreciate that. Tony says, mechanically, there's a ton of complaints they have with the DLC, but artistically and narratively, it hit every bone in your body. What do you mean by hit? Did your bones break? No, but in more seriousness, I also think it's important to bring up the actual performance issues of the DLC. I think those criticisms are legitimate. I have always been underwhelmed and even slightly disappointed with the performance of Elden Ring on PS5 and my PC, which is a little bit better than a PS5, but like marginally so. Let me just move my monitor a bit. And I always hated how much pop-in there was for the grass for each area. Not as you like first load into an area, that's a different thing, but like as you're traversing through the world, it sucks. Parts of the game are an eyesore. I think overall the art direction is pretty strong, but I think they might benefit from maybe going something a bit more stylized in the future. Pixie said you had 8 at Mesmer. Like I said, I like to explore. When I got to Mesmer the first time, I actually don't remember because I went to the Shadowkeep early, but I deliberately avoided that door because it looked ominous. So I definitely explored like the entire southern and southeast half of the map before getting into the Shadowkeep. And then Matthew said, you just missed the feeling you had day 1 before you used any, and before they changed the scaling to be more front-loaded. You're getting your ass handed to you and loving it. So yeah, like I said in my video, I really enjoyed the progression of the open world without blessings. It was just like the bosses felt really challenging. Well, not like challenging, they just felt really spongy because, you know, no blessings, and they just did a crap ton of damage to me. It was almost like a bit of tonal whiplash, which is why I legitimately wondered if the blessings only worked on the bosses. So I was kind of surprised to find out that that wasn't the case, to be honest. So Dylan said, on the PS5, the grass pop in, and you wish Untouched Sights of Grace sparked further in the distance. It's understandable. And also, welcome back to the stream. You also think some builds just aren't as fun in the DLC? Your Intelligence Caster is not nearly as fun, overpowered with standard enemies, underpowered with bosses. I think part of that is just because of how aggressive the bosses are, and how quickly the aggro can shift. One of the like weirder things that I've noticed is since I've been trying to get like some more dedicated footage, it's just like how often bosses will stop being aggro on one target to target the player for seemingly no reason. The Divine Lion Beast is probably one of the worst things that I've ever tried to capture footage for because of how mobile it is throughout its arena and how often it would come to attack me during its fight. So, oh my god, the Radon fight, it literally would be impossible to try to get footage of it. So I actually busted out the cheat engine so that way I didn't have to worry about trying to get 30 seconds of footage at a time that I could potentially use, because it just wouldn't work. So, bosses switching targets mid-combo is so frustrating. It makes sense at times, but with the Divine Lion Dancer, I literally had my character in a corner crouching so that way he would be out of frame, and he would still de-aggro from my minion to hit me. So, enough of that diatribe. Now that we're 1 minute into the video, let's go back on in. Hey Corey, nice to see you again.
Community that prides itself on getting good at a game turn its back completely on what they preach. How does a game that has always led players to experiment not send the message clear enough?
So, just to give a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to that question, I think it's a very good question, but for me, my initial impression is there's a difference between getting good versus getting good RNG, and that's what a lot of the bosses felt like. Even on my lore playthrough, when I'd had all my blessings against Radon and Mikola, like part of it is a skill issue of trying to wait to find a moment to summon my mimic without getting hurt. And then other parts of it is like, bro, I don't want to like have to wait around. And sometimes it's just a bit more efficient to just walk into the door, summon the mimic, and if I get hit, just kind of reset and wait for the good RNG so I can start the fight at a completely full flasks, relatively speaking, and a summoned mimic, which is just, it's a choice that they made, and some of that criticism is also applied to Bale for that very indeed reason. Skill issue? I mean, it really is, but yeah. Okay.
How can every Elden Ring player learn the lesson that From Software placed in the game from day one? I am proud to say that we have come full circle, and it feels like release week of base Elden Ring all over again. With the release of Elden Ring's newest expansion, Shadow of the Erdtree, it has seen a massive divide in opinions across the board, mainly on its extremely unrelenting difficulty for players ranging from newbies to Souls veterans, but also some other glaring issues that need to be addressed. It has been just over a week since its launch, and the first impressions from the community have been all over the place. Things like the DLC is too hard, the DLC is their greatest ever, this DLC doesn't adhere to the wider community, this DLC is the most accessible yet, the DLC killed my favorite weapon. It also comes with very important questions, like, does the new mainstream appeal of Elden Ring hurt it in the sense that it will lose the identity that makes the games unique? And will From Software officially step in to respond to these issues and provide more balance than their sudden calibration update buffing the Scooby-Doo fragments? We look.
I like how it's pretty much universal that everybody just dunks on the name of Skidoo fragments, yeah, i.e. Shadow fragments. But yeah, beyond that, I was going to say, with a lot of the criticisms that he brought up from like referencing other people's reviews and whatnot, I don't think I've heard anything that's actually disagreeable. Like, I think all of them make sense in their own right, which is kind of interesting. So, how are you guys feeling about that in the chat right now so far? FromSoft never makes mistakes, and criticizing the game means I'm bad at it. Got me.
Look at all sides of the issue and discuss how Shadow of the Erdtree split the Souls community. I should mention that this video is going to contain gameplay, items, bosses, and story spoilers for the expansion, so if that affects you, please proceed with caution. Also, subscribe, as I want to get better and better at making these videos, and complete my main quest to get to 100,000 subscribers. Subscribing and liking a video is a pure reflection on how I'm doing. So yeah, let me know if you like it. So leave a like and subscribe.
All right, I was just curious when this video was made exactly, 1 month ago, July 3rd. So a little bit less than 2 weeks after release of the DLC. So just wanted to get a bit of a scope of that. So if, Evan, you watch this reaction stream later, one bit of advice that I have for like making the videos better is probably be a little bit further away from your mic, because we're getting a little bit of a feedback. And I recognize that as I say this, I'm speaking into a not professional quality headset mic. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But I mean, that might be something that you'd be interested in.
Let's talk about difficulty for a moment. From Software has always been notorious for creating difficult games even from their roots. While Kingsfield and Armored Core games were not intentionally meant to be hard, they still posed many challenges for players at their respective releases. It wasn't really until Hidetaka Miyazaki, the absolute GOAT at making video games, came in and decided to adopt a philosophy relating to difficulty and how overcoming great challenges rewards deep satisfaction with their players, thus pioneering the Souls genre for the wide world to experience. Why do I mention then that we've come full circle? The short answer is if you know, you know. But the thing is, the topic of difficulty always comes around in almost every new From Software title. Demon's Souls gathered a lot of attention for its deviation from being a readily accessible game with proper tutorials and clear game mechanics. Largely positive, but it brought a lot of negativity for the drawbacks that came with it. Dark Souls came out and was regarded as one of the hardest games of all time, and perpetuated that belief with every subsequent entry into the series, always raising the question that's been raised to death: are these games too hard?
And it's kind of funny to me because I feel like there's a lot of recency bias in regards to looking at these generations of games, because not to date myself too much, but I remember being a wee lad playing much tougher games way back in the day, like Ghouls and Goblins, or I think in many ways even Mega Man is harder than a lot of the Dark Souls games. I mean, like the very first like 3 Mega Man games before you started getting the really good power-ups and whatnot. But the difference is like the size and scope of like Dark Souls is more punishing than dying in Mega Man, generally speaking. And a lot of the arcade games of the past were just quarter gobblers for specific reasons. And so trying to say that like these games are like the hardest made, I get where they're coming from, but I think part of the reason why people thought they were so hard is because, as I've said like constantly on this topic, is I think Demon's Souls and Dark Souls is kind of like a return to the past of gaming, and I've often compared them to like modern day Mega Man games. And so Corin thought the DLC was more of Elden Ring, just turned up a couple notches. If you loved Elden Ring, you probably enjoyed it a lot. If you're meh or not high on it, you probably didn't enjoy it. And then Scaleezy thinks some fans idolize difficulty too much, as if it's the only thing that makes the games fun. It's a fine line between like overcoming a challenge and being rewarded for doing that versus getting walled out. And I do think in many ways Elden Ring is the most accessible, and it can be the most difficult. It really just depends on the individual approach. Bloodborne makes you get good 100 until you summon an old hunter. Yeah, Pigsy said, back in the 90s, games were so short they had to make them very hard to have decent playtimes. Oh man, Lion King. So I've heard a rumor, and I don't think this makes any sense, that the creators of the Lion King game were told by Disney to make the game excessively difficult, so that way children would continue to rent it more from video stores. But I don't know if the game companies ever received kickbacks from rentals, and so that just doesn't pass the sniff test to me. And it seems like one of those urban legends. I don't know. Battletoads? Well, Battletoads, yeah, that's probably a really good example of like a game that's kind of like Dark Souls, because I was going to say, like, it's definitely got some challenging things, but it's pretty fair, especially like once you know the level design. Obviously, the hardest part of Battletoads would be the damn like laser jumping vehicle thing. But man, I loved Battletoads and Double Dragons as a kid. And then Dylan said, you think part of it is the context of when DS came out? So many major games are trending toward very, very easy. Exactly.
Do they need an easy mode? And while I think a lot of the time it's brought up, I do think it's important to not devalue the opinions of casual or players that have never experienced these games before. If we look back at Demon's Souls, we can find this old article that explicitly states that summoning was a part of the game. On a personal quote from Miyazaki,
hey, was that Quelaag? Real Souls fans know summoning was the mechanic the entire game series was based around. It's supposed to be hard, so you ask for help. It wasn't until Namco Bandai's US marketing team decided to market Dark Souls under the prepare to die catchphrase that it became associated probably with the bad stuff.
States that summoning was a part of the game. On a personal quote from Miyazaki, he said that the origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience, where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd have just got stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way back home, I wondered whether the last person in the line had made it home, and thought I would probably never meet the people who had helped me. I thought that maybe if we'd met in another place, we'd become friends. Or maybe we'd just fight. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time, simply because it's fleeting. I think it stays with you a lot longer, like the cherry blossoms we Japanese love so much. This
I forgot about that section of the quote. Yeah, so I definitely think that's a beautiful story, and I don't disagree with Miyazaki about that experience in any capacity whatsoever. However, I think maybe perhaps one of the tragedies of the Dark Souls games is that narratively, it's often shown that you end up alone when you climb to like the top of the world, so to speak. And because you kind of discard all the people that come along with you, I think it tends to funnel people into having more solo experiences rather than looking at the games as the communal type of thing that might be intrinsic to the success of many people. But then again, I also like to play the game solo, so maybe other people feel differently on that front.
Clearly inspired some form of summoning, spirits, any form of help in the game, and it wasn't until the convenient Bandai Namco marketing of the Prepare to Die version of Dark Souls that challenge without summons became a staple to the fandom. Hell, Miyazaki himself admitted that he uses the Mimic Tear's Spirit Ash summon, saying that, quote, I want to preface this by saying I absolutely suck at video games, so my approach or playstyle was to use everything I have at my disposal, all the assistance, every scrap of aid the game offers, and also all the knowledge that I have as the architect of the game. The freedom and open world nature of Elden Ring perhaps lowers the barrier to entry, and I might be the one who's befitting the most from that, as a player more than anyone else. Some players may look down on others who use summons or other items that can give you helping hand against enemies. I've never felt any shame. After all, I'm trying to take down gods and demigods. Shout out to my Mimic Tier for always being by my side. Easy modes have always been a part of games, selections, and added difficulty options on menus, and they only take away from the experience that From Software is trying to give, in my opinion. Plus, there are many games that offer these options, and I'm okay with just booting these games up and jumping in. It is the team's vision at From Software of the experience that they created after all, and I'm personally for the way that these games function.
So I think one reason why a lot of the you didn't experience the true game unless you beat it this specific way comes from how some people may feel robbed if a boss or an encounter is trivialized Whereas some people only get elated if such an experience happens for them. Like, they like being able to grind and overlevel experiences and one-shotting the kinds of challenges that might stand in their way. But unfortunately, there is kind of no one-size-fits-all solution to that, except offering enough player freedom to allow different approaches to be successful. So part of the disconnect comes from some people having a preference for overcoming adversity that is not entirely compatible with others. And if they tried a different person's approach, they just wouldn't get the same level of satisfaction if they'd done it their own way. So for me, that means fighting most bosses mano a mano and progressing over time and getting good. Like, when I was doing the lore playthrough, I was disappointed at the Midra fight because of how much work my Mimic put in, which is on me for using the Mimic to begin with. But also, it's kind of awkward managing the aggro of the bosses and like finding opportunities to heal. So it's just one of those things where like I felt it was a little bit necessary, not entirely necessary, but I just wanted to speed things up for the playthrough because lore is the focus rather than the gameplay. And I could have summoned something else like the Skeletal Militiaman or Telu, who knows, but I didn't do that. So certainly some of it is still on me, but nonetheless, my feelings of disappointment were indeed real, just because the fight wasn't as arduous as I kind of wanted it to be, because he felt like it just felt like he wasn't spongy enough, and I didn't get to enjoy each phase as much as I would have. So I actually really liked fighting him on Zero Blessings, which might be a little bit mind-blowing to some people. And like, I also really enjoyed fighting Rilana with Zero Blessings on her first phase, but then I hated it on the second phase. So it definitely felt really good finally beating Rilana with Zero Blessings when I only summoned a level 0 Skeletal Militiaman just so I'd have the opportunity to rot her. But that also goes a little bit into some of my gripes about not feeling as though I even had enough time to rot her without having to farm freaking basilisks in the Lake of Rot for an 8% chance to get a Scarlet Ionian butterfly to make rot pots. So, Dave asked what happens to the last person on the hill, and I joked that somebody on New Game Plus has to come and help them. And Dylan likes to play fully solo and offline the first playthrough, and you totally agree there's no one size fits all. Matthew says, you only enjoy summoning if it's a gank, then you can guarantee you take out at least one of the bosses, even if your summon lands the final blow. Yeah, that's kind of also my ethos for a lot of the boss fights. It's like, if you want to summon help, all right, I'll summon help. So that's just how I enjoy it. So it's kind of where my mindset is for that right now.
It tries to give everyone the same experience while giving you options to use what's at your disposal. Sekiro is a great example, especially because of the gameplay change, but I also find it funny that Sekiro gives you the option of a harder difficulty, because you can just ring a giant bell to make the game harder. And I know I'm not the only one who rang this bell not knowing what I was getting into.
Yeah, that's really funny about Sekiro. Also, like, the thing that annoys me at Sekiro is that when you ring a bell in similar games that approach difficulty like that, I don't really think it makes it legitimately more difficult if they don't adjust like enemy movesets. It just makes it a bit more unforgiving, which certainly does tie into difficulty, but it's a lot less satisfying to me. So I haven't really done a full bell run and whatnot, or like Kuro Charm run, whatever it is. Maybe I'll do that eventually someday, but I just kind of don't have the desire.
If we take a look back at some of the bosses from every game, we can see that the community then, alongside the press, didn't deem them impossible. Manus and Artorias were basically Sekiro bosses with their hyper-aggressiveness compared to the base game of Dark Souls. Many had countless deaths from the Fume Knight in Dark Souls 2, And don't even get me started on the Nameless King, who popularized delayed attack combos for the series, or Sister Freed with their excruciatingly devastating multi-phase boss fight that had people fuming all over the world. Heck, Demon Souls had a boss that literally took levels from you if you got caught in a grab attack. What is fair about that? But now we reach Elden Ring, the first title with an actual easy mode, and it's just called the Mimic Tier. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, it's the game that truly hit mainstream audiences the best, and is genuinely their most accessible and beginner-friendly title to date. It is absolutely still difficult. I don't have videos on the game's bosses for no reason, but with additions more like tutorials, the freedom of exploration if you get stuck, spirit ashes, and more, it can now be more comfortably played by a wider group of people.
I do like that one of his thumbnails was "This hurt the game" with a picture of Radon. Damn, he made that early? Wasn't this like only 2 weeks after release? Bro, that sucks. Like a big spoiler that early. I mean, I can't blame YouTubers, but I definitely know a lot of people were still trying to avoid things at that point. So anyway, the pot calling the color black with me making my video of like criticizing the DLC feels a little bit less I guess it wasn't hypocritical to begin with, but it feels like, I don't know, doesn't seem as bad if this guy was doing it too. And then Paul, welcome on in. In your opinion, these games are never about the boss fights for you. If the boss explodes in one hit, then that's fine. Most bosses in Dark Souls or Demon Souls weren't so crazy. Fast-moving bosses were the exception. Yeah, so I was going to save bringing this up later, but I think while difficulty is good, part of the reason I think the Soulsborne formula is starting to become more stale is because the character's power doesn't really scale up with the craziness of the bosses that we encounter, which, you know, that's not entirely an unprecedented take by any means. But I was thinking earlier today of like the memes about having Ronnie on the player's back. Like, why can't we ever have an option like that in a FromSoft game where if Radon has Mikola get on his back and Mikola starts doing all this crazy holy magic when Radon does his swings, why couldn't the player get Ronnie on her back to do a bunch of lunar frost type magic that could potentially like negate the holy stuff while we fight the two? And so we do have the summons, which are really cool, but it does suck that most of them are just completely outclassed by the Mimic Tier, which I don't think there's a good way to fix that other than removing the Mimic Tier, which isn't entirely fixing things. So just giving players more broken builds to make the games more fun, even if it like literally breaks the game, I don't think is entirely a bad idea if it's done well. So going back to the video.
And this fact was definitely not put under the radar. The main lesson Elden Ring teaches every player is to test a boss, then get your ass kicked, then go explore, then come back with the new weapons, knowledge, and levels to beat them.
Oh yeah, so like a good example of that would be doing all the stuff to get the Siegward questline complete in Dark Souls 3, where he just beats the ever-living crap out of Yorm. We don't get anything like that in Elden Ring. Like the closest, I mean, I don't want to compare the Storm Ruler thing to the Great Serpent Hunting Spear in the Rykard fight, because that's a different kind of gimmick. But like, what if you could have like Millicent join you with Melania and she does like crazy stuff against Melania as well, or something along those lines, but maybe also like other things that could empower the player more specifically. So maybe more Storm Ruler type effects, but less gimmicks. I don't know. Maybe if like they were reflected based off like the quest choices you made to encourage more variety in new game cycles if the player is inclined to do those. Could you imagine having the Dung Eater do something against Mikola if you chose his ending? That'd be wild. And yeah, Matt says having Ronnie in your back countering Mikola with lunar and ice spells would have been legendary. And that's the thing. It's like, even if the Radahn stuff didn't necessarily hit, people would have definitely been able to overlook that with just how epic having like Ronnie would be, or Fia, or like Godwin, essentially. Yeah, Paul said you can't have mandatory NPC summons for boss fights or people would get angry. I think yes and no. I think if it's tied to player choices, it's not as bad. Obviously, well, on my last playthrough, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to use Tyler with the summon against Radahn. Not that I was going to use him, but it just seemed a little bit weird that the quest seemed broken, especially with the way his corpse appeared in the arena after everything. And I made the choice to get rid of Anspach, but I think there are ways that they can make that work. Having Roderica in the background summoning random spirits would be cool. Exactly. Or having like Hugh throw hammers that appear back in his hand because they're Smith script. That'd be cool too. And welcome back in, Kyle. Or Gold Mask. There's ... throwing Golden Order incantations. Matthew said, you wouldn't call a summon making a fight significantly easier than it is normally mandatory. So we do have the Egon fights, and people love that because of his like voice lines and his voice actor. So I don't think summons are the only way that it can be done, but it's probably like the easiest parallel that we can make to just like broadening the ideas. All right, here we go.
It's always a satisfying payoff. And Spirit Ashes are a huge portion of the game for a reason too. Personally, I prefer the Dark Souls style of play where it's me against a boss and I have to beat it to advance. But that is my choice, and Elden Ring is a game full of choices, builds, exploring. It's all a part of your story and what makes it so special. So what made Shadows of the Erdtree different? It's easy to say that the scaling of the enemies is a huge issue, and maybe the reliance on the new Shadow Tree fragments is an even bigger issue, but I think it's just a good idea to show you people reacting to things that you definitely struggled on.
I mean, silly. Silly!
Damn.
That just insta-kills me.
Oh, double balls! Ah!
No.
Some of these aren't even that bad, but that was a lot of damage.
See what's happening there.
Oh, cool! That's epic.
Uh-oh.
Already had a stab attack. Always watch out for... Bro, how many attacks can you do in a row?
I feel that.
Oh.
Hit him with one of these. Oh my god.
Many people deem these new bosses straight up impossible to beat, whether it was the Divine Lion's lightning phase or Relana's non-stop Tekken attacks. It really put people on the verge of tears with how long it took some of them.
I think one of the reasons why Shadow of the Erdtree seemed so extreme compared to a lot of their previous releases is because they kind of broke unwritten rules of combat that had been present throughout the rest of the games and even like the base game to some extent, where if you had a certain amount of distance against certain bosses, you typically were more free to use longer winding up moves like the Blasphemous Blade, which we saw our dude get punished for by the mobility of that divine beast dancing lion. And one of the issues for me in the DLC was not that the bosses were too mobile or too hyper aggressive or like did too much damage, which was like a bit of a Shadow Tree thing for me, but it was the combination of all three. It wasn't like the Divine Beast's gimmick was that it was a very mobile monster because it had like two dudes piloting it. It also did a crap ton of damage with certain attacks, and it was also hard to like get a read on a lot of its patterns because of like the camera, which might tie into like the movement and speed of it. But there was I felt like very few of the new bosses felt what I would consider like old school fair bosses. I think Midra was really good, even though he's kind of hard to read, in the same way that Dancer of the Boreal Valley is hard to read, which is perfectly fine. You just kind of have to like get it or you don't. Whereas certain bosses like Bale or Radon were just too hyper aggressive and did too much damage, and you never really felt very safe performing some actions against them. I think Commander Gaius is also really terrible for that exact same thing, where one of my biggest criticisms was not knowing when I was safe to attack and also not knowing when it was safe to punish based off some of their movement patterns. So it led into this weird do I or don't I moment and hesitation leading to defeat with a lot of these bosses, because on some of them, if I immediately attacked after they did something, I could be completely fine, but if they did a different RNG pattern after that attack, I could be punished. So it made too many attacks feel unsafe to try to get in some damage, whereas it felt like my windows to attack and punish these bosses were very infrequent, and they led a lot of the fights to feel a little bit unsatisfactory to me, because even when I did have opportunities to catch some of the bosses, they might have just been so mobile that they could move out of the way, or they just kind of moved in ways that I wasn't expecting. Dylan liked Midra too. So yeah, Midra was a good fight. I actually really liked the Sunflower fight when it wasn't crashing, not like literally crashing, when it wasn't dropping so many frames and it can dodge its attacks properly. I thought that fight was very fair, except for maybe the third phase of its explosions is a little bit much, but I don't know. I didn't have too many problems with it. I just kind of mitigated it with what I could, but maybe not all builds can do that. I felt Rolana's first phase is really good, even though it did annoy me that some of her hits could dead zone the player. And for anybody who's wondering what dead zoning is, so if you're like blocking with a shield or something, a dead zone would be hitting you through your block at a part of your body which isn't protected by your like blocking animation. So she had like this one chain of attacks where I think it's like the second or third hit in the chain sweeps low underneath the block to the side of the player, so you take a full hit of damage even though you're blocking and facing her at the same time. So well, that kind of sucked against her Lana. She wasn't as over the top as many of the other bosses, which felt phase one, which made phase one feel a lot more fair to me than other bosses. And part of the reason why I dislike phase 2 for Rolana as much as I do is because of the hybrid damage, making it so that even if you do try to block, you can't fully mitigate that damage, and it becomes more of a war of attrition, which isn't as much of a deal if you're actually using the blessings and whatnot. But I just could not get a good read on her fire attacks. I was really good at dodging a lot of her magic stuff, but there's just something about her fire ones for me where I just could not figure out where to stand. And that's a bit of a skill issue, but also a legibility issue, which might be a bigger problem with a lot of these bosses. Look at these people raging. Yeah, a lot of these seem a little bit, just standard gameplay. I mean, even I had a couple like ragey moments for the gameplay on my lore through when I was actually using the blessings. But some of those were just because like the moves, like I don't even know what to do about them. And then Pixie says, as a percent of health, is it really that bad? Margaret will kill you in 3 hits. I think it depends on what the hits are. And if you're like getting hit stunned, or like if they feel like fair hits, that doesn't really bother me too much. Like if you get hit 3 times and you're not healing in between them, it might not feel so bad. But if those 3 hits start with the Death Bird hitting you with one of its attacks, and then the hit stun causing you to get hit by a second and third follow-up attack, that can definitely feel really bad. Captini said, you kind of feel like people stopped parrying in Elden Ring. Whenever you watch people, they never parry. So one of the things about parrying is that it does require stamina, and for me, a lot of the attacks are indiscernible from many other attacks while they're in their wind-up phases, which makes it a lot harder to parry. And certain parry animations are better with different techniques, like Karyan retaliation versus like the buckler parry versus like a dagger or curved sword parry are completely different beasts. And some of the animations don't seem like you parry when you should against them. I said that poorly, but I think you know what I meant. And also welcome back into the stream, Captini and IE Not and Methoda. Elden Ring is your first Soulsborne game, and you think Shadow's bosses were difficult, but they were so much fun. Especially Rolana and the Beast, even with summons and NPCs. Messer fell on 2 tries, unfortunately. Yeah, that sucks. Which one are you calling the Beast? Are you calling Metter the Beast? And Metter is another fun and fair boss, I think. And Dylan said, yeah, there's so many spells you can basically never use now for various DLC bosses. You do think some of them are just a hair too aggressive. And I feel the same way. I feel like if you got like a quarter of a second windows extra on some of these attacks, they would feel so much better and a lot more fair to me. Like, oh man, like I got really tilted fighting Gaius when he would do some of his attacks, and while he's still in his like first attack animation, I would try to follow up with a jumping attack to position myself better, deal some damage against him, and depending on his RNG, he would transition into a different attack pattern which could still hit me. So it's just like, do I go or do I not? And it's just really rough for some of them. Methoda asks, do I have any thoughts on what would be a better way to make these bosses harder other than what FromSoft has done? So it depends on what you mean by harder, and let me hydrate real quick and also think of a good way to potentially phrase this, but I might not have the best answer, to be fair. But I think a lot of it also depends on like testing, but I'll get to that in a second. And some of it also just goes into like whether or not the Soulsborne formula is a bit too overused and whether they need to make more innovations into combat in general. But I'll talk about that in a moment for the difficulty part in a second. All right, so how to make bosses harder other than what FromSoft has done. So let's first go with the premise of, do the bosses need to be harder to begin with? And I think there can be varying answers to that, and I don't necessarily think they need to be harder than they are now. I don't think they need to be harder than they were in the base game. I think the DLC has gone a step too far, but one way that you could do that would be having different attack patterns based off of the environment of like what the player is doing. So if you summon for the boss, maybe they have a different kind of mechanic to try to deal with that summon, or like what you're doing, or things like that. Another difficulty thing, and this isn't necessarily for like the bosses in general, would be potentially like limiting or funneling players to certain things so they don't necessarily have the ability to just run past all the enemies to do what they need to do. And that's one of those double-edged swords where the game can become really tedious on second and third playthroughs of content if you're just trying to get from point A to point B, but they have a bunch of bullcrap in between you. So I don't know what the most elegant solution for that is, but for me, and I've harped on this a lot, like my most idealized form of a truly open world game would be one which kind of reacts to what the player does canonically. And so when I first saw Elden Ring, I was like, oh man, if this is truly open world, are the bosses going to be like killing each other and getting new power-ups based off of like what we do? Is this truly going to be like a war with all these demigods, and like, is it going to be a full-on free-for-all? So for me, I thought it'd be amazing if you could go into like a new game plus cycle and have a completely different order and power-ups of the bosses that you face depending on your choices. So for example, Godric is a pushover normally, and we typically fight him first, but what would happen if you skipped Godric and then fought Radahn first? And while you fight Radahn, maybe Godric goes into Liurnia and fights Rennala and grafts something of Rennala into himself and gets more powerful. So maybe on your second playthrough, like Godric is slightly more powerful and has like new attacks that you weren't expecting. But what if you extended that even further? Whereas like, okay, you kill Radahn first, then you skip Godric, and then you go into Liurnia and fight Rykard. And then Godric goes ahead and like kills Morgott or something. And then now you're fighting a Godric that has both like lunar magic, maybe not entirely like blood flame magic, but you know, all this different stuff, but apply it for all the demigods, like these different variations. So obviously that'd be extremely time consuming to do, but I think it would make New Game Plus much more rewarding. And a lot of the difficulty would come from novelty rather than like movesets, which is one of the things. And then another way you can make things a bit more difficult would be the way that you telegraph fights. And you could like compare this to other ARPGs. Maybe things, this might not be the best example, but hopefully you'll understand what I mean by it. By like pseudo bullet hells like Nier Automata and those types of games. And then Dylan was saying you still don't know when to save for some bosses. Some bosses do input reading for heal punishes so frequently. Yeah. I always liked the Godskin Apostle's ability to input read when you heal, because I feel like a bit of an idiot every time I get hit by the black flame orb for when I heal too cheekily there. And then Dylan said you just cannot parry. You can't get past the first boss in Sekiro. Oh, damn. And you have 35 hours in that game. Make sure that your TV or monitor is calibrated. And not only your TV, but also your audio setup. And that will make a huge difference. Oh, the Divine Beast. Okay, let me reread your comments. Oh, yeah, you enjoyed the Divine Beast fight. I definitely like aspects of that fight, but it has some of those issues, too. Like, a lot of attacks in Elden Ring that you can jump over in the DLC just don't entirely look like they should be jumped over. So, for example, Bale has the nuke that breaks up the ground that you can jump over. I would never have guessed that in a million years. It was just kind of luck that I chanced to jump over. I mean, it wasn't luck, like I thought about it, but I didn't really expect it to work. I think I was just like trying things against the Putrescent Knight, and I found out that you're supposed to jump over his flame attacks when like the flames look tall enough that they should hit me, but they don't. So that was a little bit surprising. And as I was talking about like the mechanical side of things earlier, obviously Elden Ring is in a certain kind of state, but I also have wished that they had like the Goomba stomp of Sekiro. They could also incorporate more like mechanical things like Sekiro had, like the prosthetic tools or things of that nature to increase types of difficulty. Yeah, once Sekiro clicks in your mind, it becomes a blast. So yeah, I don't want to like give away the secret for like Sekiro, but there's like once you kind of understand the actual intended flow of combat of Sekiro, it almost becomes trivialized and kind of like riding a bike. It is easy to forget some things, don't get me wrong, but after my second playthrough of the game, I'm like, okay, I don't think I'll ever forget how to like truly play this game anymore. Bosses should also use their environment. You only think Malekith really does that. And so they do have some cool stuff like that with the Abyssal Woods. Obviously, that's not a boss fight exactly, but they could indeed incorporate more environmental design into their boss designs. So although it kind of sucked in Dark Souls 3, I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with the Ancient Wyvern fight and that form of gimmick. So if they did more stuff like that, it could be good. Oddly enough, I think Lords of the Fallen did a pretty good job of that with its like giant baby fight. I forget the boss's name, but he would put a pool of lava on the ground, and then you'd kind of go up to the second layer and fight him in a different location. So, not to say that like Lords of the Fallen is perfect by any means, but they did do some very interesting things in that game that I really liked and want FromSoft to incorporate into their games, like having more native ranged tools for boss encounters, because I think FromSoft suffers from trying to balance bosses from individual melee and ranged options when they would probably benefit from doing hybrid options and giving players specific ranged options for each build to deal with enemies depending on like their distance from each other. I didn't play the PS2 game Shinobi though, but I played, the Shinobi games for the Genesis, which might be a completely different franchise now that you mention it. Oh yeah, Matt brings up an interesting point that if Torrent made you auto-dismount within a certain radius of some enemies. Well, so I don't know about like all enemies, but maybe some that would be like ringing like disrupting bells, I think would be a certain way of adding more attention to the overworld and traversal. Yeah, that sounds cool, Captini. Sekiro feels like a rhythm game once you hit the flow. It's kind of interesting how many people say that. I don't know if who said it first and if it just stuck in the cultural zeitgeist of Sekiro, but it's so true, and it sucks if people just can't get it. Okay, let's go back into the video.
A lot of the time, it was so difficult to find windows to punish when it felt like all they did was attack. And if you wanted to just tank it, say goodbye to your health. Let me also put it this way. Kai Cenat started his Elden Ring journey almost a month ago, and most definitely improved by the time the DLC rolled around. I won't show it here, but it took him almost 30 hours to get to the final boss, which based off of reviews and playtime...
Is that for the base game?
Seemed pretty standard for the DLC, but it took...
Okay, so DLC 31.
Took him another 60 to actually beat it without using summons or spirit ashes.
Damn.
This even got him to get a...
Without summons or spirit ashes. So he was still using blessings. 60 hours against Radahn. Man, that's rough. I definitely didn't put that much time into Radahn, but I also went pretty degenerate against him because I was over it, man.
Therapist to console him on stream. Despite this insane time sink, Kai still holds strong on this opinion on the game.
And I'm getting through these motherfuckers. It's a skill issue. I'm in your ass. But your ass, though. You really like say this too hard. Put your big boy pants on, go out there, and go fight.
And this whole debate even sparked a famous Moist Critical rant on the whole too hard discussion.
Maybe I should watch that. Yeah, like, no, I get exactly what he's saying, and he is kind of right to an extent, but I think there's a difference between, like, saying something's too hard and how that gets wrapped into the idea of enjoyment. So there is enjoyment to be had in overcoming or dealing with hard things, but I feel like, for me at least, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, I didn't enjoy the DLC bosses as much as I would have liked, and for that reason, it's kind of disappointing. And I'm sure like many people feel similarly on that front. And hey, Oni, how's it going? Nice to see you again. You think we need to improve as a society and start being able to criticize from games again? I mean, that's what we're doing, one video at a time. Yeah, if the Wraiths could knock you off torrents, that'd be a really cool thing. So that's kind of one of the things that's cool about the Revenants. I do wish that FromSoft made certain things more clear and they had more redundancy in some of their design options. Like, one of my constant criticisms of the game is like, it's absolute garbage that there's only one bell bearing for each like upgrade thing. Like, why can't we get multiple bell bearings or anything like that? So it's like, no, you have to go here, you have to go there, you have to go there if you want to be able to upgrade multiple items. But anyway,
must also be made clear that the expansion isn't just throwing these stupid scalar numbers on enemies and bosses for the sake of making it difficult, and are still in fact adhering to their improvement on accessibility with Shadow Tree fragments and Revered Spirit Ash blessings. A lot of people are torn on it because some believe that even with the feature, the bosses still pose an extreme threat.
I mean, that's true. You guys saw on my lore through that when I was walking into the Radon arena with 61 vigor, excuse me, and my black flame protection spell on, I was still losing probably literally 85 to 90% of my health if he hit me with his magnetic spin while I was summoning my mimic. Now, obviously, I did use my mimic, so a third of my health went to that, so it's about 60% of my health maybe that was being completely reduced with one attack that I was animation locked into getting hit from an extreme distance away.
While many say that the people complaining are probably not taking full advantage of it, even the official Bandai Namco and Elden Ring Steam pages made sure to tell the whole world of its existence and how it works, because it may have either gone over a lot of the player base's heads, or it was just pretty miscommunicated to everyone. On a personal anecdote, I have friends who don't read any items or use any sort of builds when fighting. They just bash their heads against bosses until something works. And while that's fine and all,
I mean, honestly, that doesn't surprise me whatsoever. That's more or less what I did on my first Dark Souls playthrough. God, my build for that character is so bad. It's what I always refer to as the quintessential like first playthrough build, where you just kind of stat up into every single stat that you have, because anytime you pick up a new item, you're like, oh, what's this do? And you want to see how it works. And you just kind of brick yourself in the process. Obviously, Elden Ring is a hell of a lot more approachable on that front with the ability to respec, but if you don't understand how the stats are supposed to work or how they stack in Elden Ring, you can have some issues, but you go and learn somehow.
I can't give into credibility of complaints that a boss is too hard if you didn't take the time to read something that is in your face and made clear on how it works.
That's true.
Shadow Tree fragments literally turn your stats yellow. They have that much focus on them. A lot of people went into the DLC thinking that over-leveling would make bosses much easier, just like the base game, when really it's these fragments that make all the difference. This can be seen as a two-sided coin though, since the Shadow Tree fragments make that much of a difference. But I do think this was one of the only ways
I love Costa del Sol.
Microsoft could have balanced the DLC for everyone. I think a lot of new bosses being difficult was just the developers expecting everyone to fully interact and explore the open world, consistently obtaining these new power-ups, alongside actively attempting the fights they were stuck on in order to learn the boss. The lesson you were supposed to learn in the main game about exploration is the lesson you will have to learn in the DLC. Now, some would argue
I would say no, except I did give up with the Radon fight, but I don't know. I like to, like I said in my review, I like to challenge myself, and I probably reset my game over 100 times to kill the grafted Scion, and then I probably spent another 100 attempts killing the damn Tree Sentinel on my very first playthrough of Elden Ring. So I skipped Morgott essentially and just explored the rest of Limgrave and Weeping Peninsula and a decent chunk of Caelid. So by the time I fought Margit, I one-shot him, and I felt bad for her, which is part of why I didn't want to use the Shadow Tree blessings, just because I knew I would pretty much do the same thing in over-level content. Yeah, that's what the music is. It's from Final Fantasy VII, the OG version. And yeah, Dylan says, you think difficulty misses the point sometimes. It is not the term to center meaningful discourse around. I mean, but at the core of it, like, difficulty is the issue, but it's the fact that difficulty is getting in the way of enjoyment. And that's kind of like the ultimate goal, I suppose. So they're all meaningfully interconnected, but it is difficult trying to like determine where exactly that line is between difficult and fun and when you go over it. Oni thinks the reasoning behind the games being hard has just changed too much. In Demons and Dark Souls 1, it was there to pull you into the world. In Elden Ring, it sometimes feels like it's only there for streamers. So that's an interesting way of putting it. I was saying earlier in stream, before you joined Oni, that I think they would benefit from giving players more broken skills and abilities to kind of match what like the enemies are doing at times. But obviously, like the PvP folk are going to be angry about that if you give people too much, but it just, like at the end of the day, it's a game, and it does feel like a little bit of a mismatch when all we can do is just a piddly little roll, and these bosses are flying into the sky and dropping literally moon meteors onto us, and we can just hop occasionally over their AoE effects. So there's a middle ground here, and I feel like the player doesn't feel as cool as these bosses, so it feels a little bit awkward that like we're the definitively strongest being around when all these other characters are doing so many other more impressive superhuman feats than we are.
That the balancing truly was extremely wacky, and From Software did just release a patch buffing the early game stats of Shadow Tree fragments in order to help people beat the first couple of bosses. So there is a level of truth if this many people were that angry about it. They wouldn't buff the Shadow Tree blessing for players if they didn't actually agree in some way. But could it be the result of a severe influx of negative reviews that forced them to make a switch? It's really hard to say, but I think it could go either way. All in all, it is difficult to quantify just exactly what's making everyone who is reporting these issues actually feel like this new expansion is impossible, because it could honestly be anything. Bushy, an extremely great player at the game, had this to say on the issues. It's been just under a week since Shadow of the Erdtree launched, and now we're seeing full new FromSoft game release cycle. It starts with the game is too hard because no one knows what the powerful weapon or strats are. Now it's shifted into creators one-shotting bosses with perfumes in Bloodfiend's arm, demonstrating that the DLC is not significantly harder than any of the From Software releases.
I get what he's saying, but I feel like that is kind of a disingenuous argument. Just because something can be cheesed, that doesn't make it any less difficult. You're just kind of cheesing it in a different way. Like, that doesn't say anything about the boss's movesets, that they can be one-shots. It's just saying that they're tools, and if people are neglecting to use them, the question is, why are they neglecting to use them? Why does it take people so long to like find these builds, or like why don't they find them natively? They need to get these kind of builds suggested to them from other people. Now, obviously there are different ways to play the game, and a lot of people are going to have easier experiences fighting bosses like Radahn if they're using abilities like Endure plus the Blood Fiend's arm and buffing it with a million different things. But that also takes a level of preparation, which I think most average players are not going to do. So it's essentially, to me, the equivalent of saying, hey, these guys are able to speedrun Super Mario Brothers 1 within like whatever it is, like 10 minutes, but you're telling me it's taking you 10 hours to beat the game? Like, you suck. Just do what they did. I mean, there's a bit of a difference between somebody who's so intimately familiar with the game versus somebody going into it for the first time. And I think that goes back into the whole MMO argument. This game gets good after 100 hours. People don't want to invest 100 hours to enjoy a game. They want to enjoy it from like minute one. And the base game, you know, it has its moments, but you can enjoy the game really early. Whereas the difficulty of some of the bosses and the scaling of the Shadow Tree fragments was rebalanced for a reason, and people weren't enjoying it. So I don't know what else to say beyond that. Pixie used the Crucible Wings to fly over a lot of attacks. Stuff is fun. The funny thing is, I was thinking of Crucible Wings a lot for my comments about like giving the player new abilities. And that's like one of the ones where I think it's so cool, but it just doesn't go far enough. Like, FromSoft, why don't you just let us soar over gaps a little bit with that Ash of War? Like, reward us for using it in a non-combat scenario. Like, that stuff is cool. It like go into a lot of the magical ethos of things. So yeah, going back to like some of the difficulty stuff, like we could do a lot more things with like player movement and spells, utility spells as opposed to combat spells. Utility things having uses in combat. So if you had like a slow fall spell, maybe that'll help with like jumping between and over certain attacks or things of that nature. Exactly, Kaskalizi. Man who plays the game professionally thinks your criticisms on the difficulty aren't valid. Exactly. Oni agrees wholeheartedly with that sentiment. You feel like From always had an issue with not wanting to make you feel powerful. Elden Ring just ups the ante so much, it makes the gap even wider. And Pixie says, the knowledge of the build is so much more powerful in Elden Ring than their other games. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like, on one hand, I think you're right. But maybe not, because I feel like in the previous games, there were things just as broken, but it was a little bit easier to get to those things just because there were less options in general, which might go back into your point about like game knowledge. But a lot of people still didn't like one-shot bosses entirely back in the day either. Oni said, none of these people are taking normal playthroughs into consideration. Radon causing you to look up a Bloodfiend arm build just to beat him doesn't make the game fairly balanced. Exactly. Exactly. I love how resorting to using cheese is the evidence that bosses aren't too hard. So this kind of reminds me of my favorite / most infuriating League of Legends arguments ever. And let me hydrate real quick. So back in the day, and I'm sure even now, you can go into like any League of Legends forum or subreddit and see people complaining about certain champions. And invariably, unless the champion is Olaf, the way that somebody is going to suggest you deal with that champion is to, quote, just CC them. It's like, no shit, Sherlock. Of course, if you CC a champion, they're not going to be able to do anything against you. Why didn't I think of that before? It's like, why don't I just play the champion, which, you know, uses CC for every one of its moves? It's such a non-answer. It's kind of infuriating, and it's baffling that many people think that that's an acceptable thing to even say, because that, like, it's true, but who isn't it true of other than Olaf? So, I digress. Oni said, not to put the blame on the fan base, but you really think it's the result of people constantly complaining about gimmicky bosses, so they just gave up trying to make the player think? Well, I don't know about that, because they still do have some gimmicky bosses, and I think they're some of the best iterations that they've done yet. Like, Renala's first phase is an entirely gimmick boss. It's a little bit underwhelming, but I think overall the actual game design, and maybe not game design, let's say level design of that first phase is phenomenal. If not super challenging. I think the Rykard fight was actually really well implemented for that variety of the Storm Ruler mechanic, but I do wish alternative ways to fight him were still more viable beyond super ranged spellcaster builds. So, what's another gimmick fight in the game? I thought there was one. Oh, the Lamenter. The Lamenter is a great gimmick fight, but it's also a terrible gimmick fight. And it could have been great had there been a bit more lead up into how that mechanic worked. It was just a little bit odd and out of left field getting as that encounter completely on a cold read. So they can do gimmick fights and they can do them well, but one of FromSoft's critical issues is they just don't establish things or tutorialize them very well. Why is Nightbot always screwing up my stretch message? Anyway, here we go.
And that's not to say that the DLC is easy, it's to say that all of these games are meant to be difficult, and it's easy to forget that when you've had the opportunity to play and practice the same bosses for over 2 years. I imagine there will be a revisionist narrative that the DLC was too hard until the patch, But in reality, these games are more difficult when you know less about them. With a small amount of time and learning, the challenges that were previously considered insurmountable become very possible. One thing I do notice in Elden Ring bosses is that the scripted attacks follow up with another or not, depending on distance from the boss, and if you're going for another attack, which can make them feel more alive, but at the cost of consistency. That's just a personal...
Yeah, one thing that I noticed about Rolana, especially the second playthrough, was that if I didn't get close to her, she wasn't going to use her fire attacks, and those are the ones that always gave me trouble, so it just incentivized me to keep more distance on that boss battle.
Personal note there. Overall, it's not the first time a DLC and/or game has had the issues that are being generally reported, but I do wonder if, apart from this calibration update that was put out, if From Software is going to fold on rebalancing the current state of the game.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see what, if anything, they're going to do with the future passes. They did a surprising amount of PvP balance passes in the base game, so I'm really curious to see how much of a life cycle the DLC will have as far as post-launch updates are concerned.
This is the part of the split that I feel like isn't being touched on by almost anyone, and I feel like I should talk about it. Performance. The other main part of the criticism Shadow of the Erdtree garnered was getting the general performance across people's machines. Even some extremely tanky builds were finding it very tough to run even when not a lot was happening in-game, and that includes tuning down the graphical settings to low. With how some of the bosses were spouting particles and magic, and this and that every single attack, forget it. It would just add on to the struggles people were facing. Consoles were no exception to this as well. And
oh, cool. They bring up Digital Foundry. Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about game design, so I could very well be wrong about this, but I think Elden Ring loads too many assets in the background that aren't going to be used by the player at a given moment, which really tanks a lot of the performance metrics. So when you're here in Skidoo Altus, you're actually loading the entirety of the Skidoo Altus and a lot of the lower resolutions of like the Shadowkeep and whatnot, as well as like the Gravesite Plain because of the vantage that you're able to see it in. But also, I think one of the oddest places which had like some of the worst performance for me was the Cathedral of Manus Meter, because it must be loading in the underground finger area while you're up above, as well as all the stuff outside it with the little puppeteers, or puppets rather than the puppeteers. And so that there's just a lot of performance issues of this game. And I think part of the reason people don't touch on the performance stuff is because we don't have the technical knowledge to understand whether our issue is localized to our specific machine versus a general issue of the performance of the game, which is one of the questions that Digital Foundry was asked by like one of their viewers, is like, how come more reviews don't touch on the technical aspects of things? And the DF team is like, oh, we don't really know exactly, and perhaps some of it is just because they don't know if it's like, they don't even know like what to check to compare it against, because the Digital Foundry team have like such a crazy amount of knowledge about like all these technologies. It's kind of mind-blowing to me, whereas I'm just like, yeah, stuff looks choppy. You know? So like, even if I wanted to touch on what performance issues I had, I don't have the technical skill set to articulate what those issues are, or to identify what those issues are, to articulate them, and to falsify whether these issues are limited to my specs or something else. So unless you're doing consoles specifically, it's kind of tough to talk about performance. And a lot of the performance stuff can also just be overlooked because, well, it can be a bit of a mood killer. It doesn't entirely like break the fundamental experience for the most part. Like, it has to be pretty egregious for people to get really upset about it. Or, well, that's not true. It could be pretty trivial and people can get like super upset, like the widescreen support. I definitely understand people wanting support for their monitors, but that's just kind of the price you pay of like going widescreen. Like in 2024, you should still understand that it's just a non-standard like resolution and viewing experience, and it has like a lot of extra tax that it does on the performance of a system when it's rendering so much more as far as the games are concerned. So it's just less of a priority, and if they don't touch it, it's like, what are the cost benefit analyses of touching up those aspects is just another thing to ask ourselves. Captini said, you find the hardness of bosses to change a lot if you do it next day again. You know that you need to rest to make you overcome some of the bosses. And you tried Sword Saint for 5 hours, but won it very easily the next day on your first try. So yeah, some people perform a lot better after they've rested. And there is the whole thing of like getting tilted, which is very true. And sometimes rest is all you need. I honestly feel like rest is kind of, I don't want to say like bad for me, but I feel like I do a lot worse on a cold read of a boss than just getting good and overcoming it. Scowleasy said, even on the PS4, the DLC was sluggish for you. You know the PS4 isn't exactly new, but the performance seemed to be a universal issue. Apparently, the best performance for Elden Ring, other than like the top-of-the-line PC builds, was to run the PS4 version on the PS5. Go figure.
And reviewers such as IGN made it clear that it dropped off for them since the newest update. Base Elden Ring had a few issues regarding performance too, and it may or may not still be in the game, but sometimes just stuttering around areas for quite literally no reason, especially the first Tree Sentinel fight, and some places in Altus Plateau, unfortunately don't take the cake compared to some of the graphical issues that we're running into in the Shadow of the Erdtree. I want to stress that Elden Ring is an absolutely gorgeous game with both a unique and fantastic art direction that separates it from so many other titles and is genuinely just a marvel to look at. It's just straight up unfortunate that this fact is bogged down by these issues. I
feel like I'm in the minority here, but to me, like, Elden Ring has looked okay. It's never been like super phenomenal to me, with the exception of when I saw the first trailer and the way that they made the spells look. I was like, oh man, this actually looks like next gen for FromSoft. But I think it's serviceable, but not like super phenomenal, if that makes sense. And I know it like won Best Art Direction, which I could see why it won. I do think there are many good elements of the game design, like having the landmarks in the sky with like the Erdtree and whatnot to help direct players. I think it was a brilliant move, but it's all right, you know? So like for me, games that stand out a bit more artistically, and one that I constantly reference in this category specifically, would be something like Persona 5. But nonetheless, one of the reasons why I do like Elden Ring is that it does show that you don't need to have the most cutting edge graphics to have a great experience playing a game. And I think Elden Ring has probably been a bit of a wake up call for a lot of players, in that you don't have to have the highest fidelity graphics to have a true like AAA experience and whatnot. Graphics are okay. Art direction's great. Yeah. It's hard for people to separate graphics from art. Well, I don't know. Like, there are definitely aspects of Elden Ring to me which are peak design, like Estelle, Rykard after he's dead and like Tanith is eating him. I'm okay with the Elden Beast. I think it's a really cool concept, I guess, but it just doesn't actually hit for me, which I know is probably gonna be disagreeable to some people. But anyway, like the Abductor Virgins, I think are super cool. I wish I had more stuff like the Artifice stuff. I thought that was like one of the best parts of Elden Ring, and I wish there was a lot more of it, like the Rey Lucarian Stone Mask soldiers and whatnot is stuff that I like. Oh man, the Scarlet Bloom of Ionia, true top tier design when Millennia blooms on top of Radon. So there are definitely some really high moments, but a lot of this stuff is just like okay in general. We need more depth in games, not wrinkles on the faces. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that I really appreciated about Persona 5, is that even though like a lot of the NPCs are completely inconsequential, they don't try to like adhere to like the reality of rendering everybody. They just make the actual NPCs in many locations literally faceless, because that's just kind of like how people get blended together in the mind's eye when you're in a place as dense as like actual Tokyo. Like you just cannot process that much information, so they just kind of become like amorphous shapes in some ways. Yeah, I'll agree that some of the vistas are really good. Like when you go from Stormvale toward Liurnia and look over the lakes, really good stuff. The Caelid Bloom, when you look on the Scarlet Ionia flower in the swamp, really good vista as well. But some of the other stuff is not as good, unfortunately. So anyway, moving on from that topic.
I really do think that despite making their best game yet with so many masterpieces that preceded Elden Ring, From Software unfortunately just does and should not get a pass in this department. And they most certainly need to address this across the board, as this is another part of the accessibility spectrum that hurts the general player base. I really do wish that they had reached some better.
So for instance, this might sound a bit weird, but in some ways I actually prefer the art style of Dark Souls 1 to a lot of their other games, more than Dark Souls 2, more than Dark Souls 3. I think Bloodborne is its own thing, which is kind of peak for its own reasons. But Elden Ring just kind of felt like a step down to me as far as like the visuals went. And then Koi Pop, nice to see you again. No one does long dark shadows across grass-dense meadows better than Elden Ring. So about that, I would legitimately argue Ghost of Tsushima might do that better. The landscapes and how well they captured distant foliage is exceptional. Pop-in is amenable to on the grass and stuff. I disagree about the pop-in, and the fact that we have it at all just kind of annoys me. It really takes my immersion out of the game. Oni thinks Dark Souls and Bloodborne's art styles are tighter and more unified. Elden Ring tackles so many things that it's hard to even pinpoint what the style is. Kind of, yeah. So I think like even like disregarding the whole like there's a cosmic element to Elden Ring compared to like the medieval stuff, there's just something about the presentation of a lot of like the smaller facets of the game world which just I don't know how to describe it. It just doesn't feel as stylized or tight to me as like Dark Souls did. But Dark Souls might have been a bit too oppressive, so maybe it's not the fairest of comparisons to make, but this is just one of those vibe checks things for me because I don't know how to articulate my thought better.
Better technological advances with how they handle these graphics in the expansion, but I guess for now, we just have to wait. All of the criticism regarding the performance is entirely valid, and something needs to be done about it. If you played Elden Ring on launch, then you remember that Pot Friend wasn't a proper quest in the base game, and you remember how many quests and dialogue were either placed in after patch or...
To be fair, Alexander's quest was fine, but Jar Baron didn't exist. So he's kind of right, but kind of not. Like I tend to look at Jar Baron and the Dialos thing as a separate part of Alexander's quest line, despite the tie-in.
Removed entirely before the game came out. I made a video on the original Frenzied Flame quest with Kale and his brothers, and this insane tragic dialogue.
Did you see what they did to my ancestors? The whole clan buried alive, sick, maddened, husks of themselves.
This was cut, and Alexander was added. But the main thing to both of these was that if they both didn't exist, there would be a small lack of substance. I found people discussing that the DLC had some large areas with almost nothing to do, and I have to agree. Unless there is some secret other than parrying the lantern enemy in the woods, I found that there was no reason for this section to be this long without being able to ride Torrent. I love this area, but another dungeon or a couple of mini-bosses, hell, a quest with an NPC, could have helped a lot here, since it's just an empty space until Midra's Manse. The same goes for those large finger areas on the map.
Oni doesn't like the cut of his jib. I mean, I kind of agree though, and I think the DLC would be improved if we even just had like merchants of some sort to give a little bit more life to a lot of these emptier regions. And Captini said, you think that modern gamers can't imagine missing information in games as well as people who used to play as like Nintendo as kids? You tell your kids to just fill the missing information with what they think it should be? Very simple sprites were able to tell as much as most detailed games to you these days. Well, that might also tie into the differences between CRT technology and the displays of today not allowing for that kind of more enriched display of pixel information. So I think I have something saved about that recently. Give me 1 second just to show how drastic the effect can be. I don't have it. Give me one more moment. I'm gonna fudge. I fudged. CRT versus LCD. Okay, this should be good enough. So this is one of those things where it is kind of like personal preference how you look at something. Let's try to make this bigger. All right, so this is what a game like on the Super Nintendo would look like when you would play it on the old tube type televisions versus what you get on like an emulator and an LCD. So this is a lot more pixelized because we're seeing the pixels correctly, but it's also flatter because the CRT image would soften the way that things are shown because they didn't actually display pixels. There's certain intricacies to the technology which I don't fully understand, so I'll just leave it there. And so a lot of the games in our mind's eye as children did actually look more detailed to us back then because of the limitations of the technology. So for me, like one of the best examples of it is from this image, whereas like this is incomprehensibly different. Like this just looks like a wonky guide. Like no wonder why your kids might not be able to like fill in the gaps because it's pretty stark. But this dude, he looks like he's emerging out of the darkness and is about to stab you and maybe grab you, or maybe he's like holding something in his other hand, and it just has a completely different vibe. And so same thing with this. I could see why some people might prefer the LCD or LED version of this because there's like a higher contrast, but this just looks a lot more soft and kind of realistic as a face. And you got to imagine, like, what is this, a 32-bit game? No, it's probably more like 16, isn't it? I don't remember what the Genesis was. Oh, cool. So we got the error thing. Oh, maybe this looks worse the more blown up the image is. Yeah, okay, so this isn't like the best example, but hopefully that makes sense. Oh, you agree with that sentiment? You're just not a fan of how he presents his arguments? That's unfortunate. Koi Pop said, NPC side quests are definitely an area the Souls games need to work on. At least DS3's NPCs warped away when you finished one of their steps. Yeah, I definitely agree that the NPCs could use refinement. So yeah, I mean, they're coming up with like more filters to make old games like look how they used to, but I don't know. It's just kind of like some things that we took for granted just because we didn't know any better. Like the games back then looked like they had more depth because they kind of actually did. It's kind of wild how different they look when they're all like shrunk down. Oh yeah, the peach one right here is pretty good. Yeah, this just looks a lot worse when it's zoomed in this much, but I think on this version over here, it looks better. Like, she kind of like blends into the background a lot more. So like the shading looks more natural. But when you zoom in this much, it kind of looks like garbage, to be honest. Which is why it's always weird talking about this. And we should also keep in mind that we're probably all watching this on like an LCD or OLED of some sort. So it's not even like we can even truly appreciate what it would actually have looked like on a CRT. So anyway, enough of that point there. Let's go back into the video.
There is so much space that these take up on the map, but almost no real reason to be here outside of sounding the horn for the finger quest. And again, I know this DLC is gigantic and it's one of the best ever made, but I just feel that there's inconsistencies here that shouldn't be discounted. I can still love the DLC and feel this way. You can too. I promise you, it's going to be okay. I would almost expect From Software to add either another quest or something small to these sections in the future, like they added PvP to the Coliseum areas, but this part of the criticism is one that I see slip under the radar.
I'm still a bit surprised that we didn't get a boss rush mode of some sort, although, man, now with these DLC bosses, I don't know if I want one.
I genuinely believe that Elden Ring reaching a much more mainstream appeal is the biggest blessing possible for From Software, but I do think that the question of a wider audience tarnishes a game's identity is something that should be addressed overall. Arrowhead director Pillisted, the guy working on Helldivers 2, said, "A game that is for everyone is a game for no one," in regards to the controversies surrounding Shadows of the Erdtree. And I really don't think there is a better game to apply it to than Elden Ring. Miyazaki himself has even admitted something akin to this, and the last thing I would ever want for these games is for it to turn into something not in From Software's creative vision. Of course, opinions and criticism should never be ignored, but to what lengths does From Software listen? The Soulsborne games have always asked a lot more out of the player than most other titles, and it seems that people are easily forgetting just how difficult they are all meant to be. If they just spoon-fed victories to the players, of what worth is the victory? I want to encourage you all to leave some constructive criticism on the matter in the comments down below, and tell me what you really think of this controversy. I love Elden Ring, and I really think Shadow of the Erdtree hit the nail on the head. It is one of the best DLCs ever made, and it is a solid 10 out of 10 for me. And I am
what the hell kind of rating is that after all these complaints? I hate it when people do that, when they're like, oh man, look at all these problems, 10 out of 10. It's like, oh man, for me, a 10 out of 10 is something that's like actually flawless. So that just makes me not trust a reviewer when they say something's a 10 out of 10 after they've had complaints about it. I just feel like it doesn't line up. So now I can't trust you.
Excited to keep talking about it. My name is Evan, and hopefully I just explained that really well. I'll catch you in the next video.
Alright, so despite all my complaints there at the end, I did like that video. We had a lot of fun discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and... Oh man, I forgot to link Charred Thermos' video too. Whoops, because of the comment that I made. So I'm going to go ahead and link Evan Explains video into chat. Wait, I'm subscribed? What all have I watched by him? I don't remember what I watched. Other than this one. Anyway, yeah. If you want to go ahead and give him a like and a subscribe, go ahead and feel free to do that. So then, Wukong 10 out of 10 after playing 1 hour. Streamers are the best. Yeah, that kind of sucks, which is why I don't like to make early reviews. I think impressions are okay and they're valuable. Honestly, I was thinking about potentially making my early impressions for the Eiyuden Chronicle game and explaining why I stopped playing it. Not because like I hated it or anything, but just because like I don't really think we get a lot of those videos on YouTube. And I think part of it is just because a lot of people are afraid of like getting the pushback for making videos like that, but maybe that's something like worth exploring. I mean, it's not as though any of my review videos have done like particularly well by any means, like nobody watches them, but I don't know, it's just kind of a cathartic to kind of get one's thoughts out there and like producing content essentially. And then Captini said 3 out of 4 streamers you tried to watch didn't finish Wukong. They all gave it 10 out of 10. That's weird. I haven't played Wukong. I'm not sure if I will, but I don't know. Like the idea of like playing, like the idea of a Journey to the West game is very interesting to me. One that's an ARPG. There have been Journey to the West games in the past. Like there's like a Japanese is it strategy RPG that came out on the PS1 that was Journey to the West, that I've heard of, but I never played. So anyway, I do like a lot of like the Chinese mythology movies on the subject. There's been a decent amount of them. There's actually a very interesting kind of lighthearted Beastmaster type Australian TV series for the Monkey King, which I watched and just kind of like to have something on in the background. It wasn't as bad as I was afraid it was going to be, because back when I was growing up, I liked to watch Hercules with Kevin Sorbo, but I'm not so inclined to watch it anymore. So I wanted something like kind of a similar vibe. So managed to find that one day and had some fun. Captini said Wukong is one of the worst Journey of the West games. Has very little to do with it. It borrows characters but has nothing to do with it otherwise. Oh, that's unfortunate. I thought, okay. So just kind of inspired by then. That's not too surprising, I suppose. But okay, everybody. That'll be it for me for tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll probably begin tomorrow's stream again with the third part of the Charred Thermos Laurence trilogy. So hopefully he manages to tie things together with that one so far. Because right now I am left a little bit disappointed. But, you know, maybe he'll make it work tomorrow. I'm skeptical, but crossing my fingers. So yeah, that'll be it. We'll catch you on the next one at the same time of 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.